Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, where time flows like a quiet river and science moves without the need to explain everything all at once. Here, we don't try to solve mysteries, we let them breathe. We let them stay mysterious. And tonight, I'd like to invite you to drift with me into one of the gentlest, strangest questions that ever sat quietly in the back of a wondering mind. What if we weren't the first? Not the first civilization. Not the first to build or think or dream. Not the first to look at the stars and wonder who else might be looking back. It's not a question that needs to be answered. It's a question meant to be felt. The way you feel the cool of deep water, or the hush of a canyon, or the slow sigh of wind across an ancient plain. Because if Earth remembers, even faintly, it remembers more than just us. More than just pyramids and satellites and fire. It remembers forests turned to coal, oceans that dried into stone, continents that drifted like slow, floating dreams. And far before the dinosaurs thundered across the land, before ferns reached into sunlight and insects grew the size of birds, there were already chapters being written in the planet's bedrock. But those pages have crumbled, pressed under the weight of new mountains, melted by the slow churn of magma, subducted into silence. What lived then? What built or tried or failed long before any fossil ever formed? There's a calm kind of science that whispers this isn't entirely impossible. Not likely, but not impossible. And in the long breath of geological time, possibility begins to soften into curiosity. Because time on Earth is not measured in lifetimes. It's measured in extinctions, in lava flows, in isotope ratios and decayed magnetic memories buried in rock. It's measured in what the Earth has lost. And the Earth has lost so much. Sometimes, late at night, it's comforting to remember that even the mountains sleep. That every city we've ever built is temporary. That entropy is the soft tide pulling everything back into the dark. Even stone wears down. Even rivers forget their names. And what we call history is only what hasn't been erased yet. So let's drift deeper now. Imagine a world where the continents are arranged like scattered puzzle pieces, not yet locked into the shapes we know. Imagine coastlines that no longer exist. Volcanoes that once lit up entire skies, now cold and buried under layers of time. Imagine a species or many that left no bones, no ruins, no fire pits or walls. Just chemical echoes. Just strange markers in the strata. Just a layer of dust, a change in carbon, a faint metallic thread in the sediment. Not because they were hiding, but because time is a master of forgetting. Could life have bloomed, evolved, reached something like awareness, and vanished? All before the first trilobite ever scuttled along the seafloor? Maybe, maybe not. But the space between those two answers is wide, and quiet, and strangely beautiful. You see, the deeper we look into Earth's past, the harder it becomes to know where certainty ends and wonder begins. The oldest rocks, the true ancients, have been melted and remade so many times, their memories are gone. Like a book rewritten by heat and pressure until even the idea of words has vanished. The crust itself is constantly moving, swallowing the evidence of whatever may have been. Subduction zones pull land beneath land, into the mantle's slow churn, where all memory is liquefied. No library can survive that. And yet we still ask, still wonder, because in every erosion line, every crumbling cliff, every fossilized ripple in ancient sandstone, there's a question waiting. Not just about what lived, but what was forgotten. What if intelligence isn't as rare as we think? What if it blooms often but briefly, like certain flowers, delicate and seasonal, never meant to last? What if we are not a beginning, but a return? It doesn't need to be Atlantis. It doesn't need to be myth. It only needs to be time. Enough time. Time to forget. Time to erase. Time to start again. And maybe that's what Earth does best. Not preserving, but resetting. A planet of memory, yes, but also of gentle amnesia. We often picture the past as a ladder. One rung after another. Fish to lizard. Lizard to mammal. Mammal to machine. But what if it's not a ladder at all? What if it's a circle? What if intelligence doesn't ascend? It pulses, peers, disappears, leaves a trace, then silence. A silence so vast, even stone can't hold it. And if that silence stretches far enough, we begin to forget that anything ever sang at all. But there are clues, faint as breath on glass. Anomalous isotopes. Carbon layers too rich, too fast. Unusual heat spikes. Unexplained extinction pulses. Not proof. Just questions. Geological whispers. And that's enough sometimes. Not to know, but to keep asking. Because if the Earth can lose a whole ocean, if it can erase mountain ranges and drown forests in stone, then perhaps it can lose a civilization too. Not in fire, not in war, but in time, in pressure, in the slow fall of ash and sediment, in the long sleep of entropy. And if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Beneath every step we take lies a world that no longer breathes. A world pressed flat, sealed shut, and folded deep into the Earth's skin. It's easy to forget, standing on pavement or grass or sand, that the ground beneath us is layered with memory. Ancient, quiet, and buried far beyond sight. Each layer a page, each page a moment, each moment a hush in the long, unspoken book of time. Most of the planet's story is invisible to us now, not because it's gone, but because it's underneath, compressed into rock, hidden under cities, swallowed by forests, forgotten beneath oceans that were once deserts, beneath deserts that were once seas. We walk across the bones of old continents. We sleep above the shattered remnants of mountain chains that have risen and fallen more than once. Underneath our homes, our schools, our roads, there are layers of time we'll never touch. Shale formed from mud that once pooled under warm Precambrian skies. Salt left behind by Permian seas that shimmered, then vanished. Sandstone made from wind-blown dunes that drifted for centuries across landscapes that no longer exist. All of it still there, still waiting, still holding the silence of things that once were. Geologists call this the stratigraphic record, a slow, reluctant archive. Not complete, not clean, but enough to hint at what the Earth once was. The Cambrian explosion, the Great Dying, the slow dance of oxygen through the air, the shifting of climate from warmth to cold and back again. These events left fingerprints like faint scratches on glass. Carbon isotope shifts, changes in shell thickness, iridium dust in unexpected places. Not because anyone intended to leave a record, but because the Earth keeps everything, even when it forgets the order. And yet, even this archive is mostly silence. You see, fossilization is a rare kindness. Most of what has ever lived is gone without a trace. Soft-bodied creatures vanish. Plants dissolve. Even bones, if left unburied, crumble into the wind. And so the deeper we dig, the more the silence grows. Entire epochs, lost. There are vast spans of time, hundreds of millions of years wide, where the rock layers are incomplete, missing, melted, subducted into the mantle, where heat and pressure erase every molecule of memory. These are known as unconformities, breaks in the record, gaps where something once was, but is no longer knowable. The Earth does not archive like a librarian. It edits like a tide. And so the silence beneath our feet is not just physical. It's emotional, philosophical. It's the ache of something forgotten that maybe never wanted to be remembered. Or perhaps it did. But memory is fragile, and time relentless. Still we dig. Core samples pulled from the seafloor reveal dark bands of clay that speak of extinction. Volcanic ash layers cooled into fine gray lines. Radiometric dating tells us the age, the decay of isotopes like uranium into lead whispering timelines older than imagination. We read the rocks like cryptic verses, always wondering what's missing between the lines. What species disappeared between layers? What dreams were dissolved before they could become form? Sometimes, scientists find oddities, objects out of place, anomalous metallic spheres in ancient layers, patterns in stone that mimic tools. The rational explanations are often sound: natural formation, misidentification, contamination. But still, the questions linger. Could we be brushing against the edge of something we don't yet understand? What if some of the gaps are not empty, but hidden, buried beneath glacial till, tucked beneath kilometers of basalt from long-cooled lava floods, or perhaps sunk under the weight of oceans, where pressure and darkness preserve secrets in silence? There are parts of Earth's crust we've never touched. The deepest mines go only a few kilometers down. The continental crust is, on average, 30 to 40 kilometers thick. And beneath that, the mantle, a realm of heat and flow where nothing recognizable remains. If something once lived, once built, once burned with thought and purpose, could it be there still, reduced to trace elements, waiting in the silence? The idea isn't proof. It's poetry. But even science needs poetry sometimes. Because the more we study the layers of Earth, the more we realize how much we've lost. Not through neglect, but through inevitability. Entropy is the law, erosion is the rhythm, and memory is the exception. Still, the rocks try to tell us what they can. The Grand Canyon reveals almost 2 billion years of time in its stone walls. The cliffs of Wales speak in slate and quartzite. In Greenland, ancient zircon crystals whisper of liquid water 4 billion years ago. These voices are faint, cracked, but real. And as we walk on them, over them, through them, without knowing. We call it ground, soil, stone. But perhaps we should call it story. A story with more missing than written, more erased than remembered, more silence than sound. And yet, if even the Earth forgets this much, loses this much, buries this much beneath our every step, then what else might lie hidden just beneath the surface? What might we find if we dared to listen harder? Or if we simply remembered to look down? Because beneath this silence, something once breathed. And deeper still, in places untouched for millions of years, something may still be waiting. And as we lean closer to that silence, to the layers, the gaps, the long-forgotten pages, we find ourselves asking not just what was, but why it vanished. And that leads us into the next question entirely. Because if so much can be lost, then what happens to the things that were never meant to leave a mark in the first place? The fossil record, for all its wonder, begins not at the beginning, but near the edge of the story. Most of what we know about life on Earth comes from the last 600 million years or so. That's when creatures began to evolve hard parts, shells, teeth, bones, the kinds of things that fossilize under pressure and time. The kinds of things that last. But Earth is old. Far older than bones. For nearly 4 billion years before that, more than 6 times longer than all of recorded human history, this planet was alive with change and movement and slow, unfurling chemistry. But what lived in that enormous stretch of time? What moved or thought or failed long before fossils became possible? We call it the Precambrian, a vast, dark ocean of time. Not because it lacked life, but because it lacked preservation. The organisms of that age were soft-bodied, microscopic, fragile, easy to miss, and easier still to erase. Algae, bacteria, single-celled swimmers, strange colony creatures whose names dissolve like silt in rain. But what else might have stirred in that deep, unlit world? What kinds of forms could evolve when there were no bones to hold them? No shells to carry, no teeth to bite, no fossilized spines to whisper their names to the future? It's a strange thought to imagine a world of life that left no skeleton behind. No grave, no imprint. And yet, life doesn't begin with structure. It begins with energy, with curiosity, with replication and change. Could it be that evolution in those ancient oceans reached for something more, and then fell silent, erased not by violence but by time? The conditions for memory were poor. There were no trees to fall and fossilize, no deserts to dry and preserve. The seafloor was an unstable quilt of volcanic activity and shifting chemistry. Tectonic forces recycled crust like paper in a flame. Even the rocks from that time are rare. Most of them melted and remade so often they forgot their own beginnings. We are left with clues, but no voices. Tiny trace fossils. Oxygen isotopes that hint at metabolism. iron layers that speak of sudden changes in the planet's breath. We see not the creatures, but their consequences, like shadows cast by lives too soft to hold. And here the imagination begins to wander, not because it must, but because the silence invites it. Could intelligence have stirred, briefly, and vanished without ever becoming architecture? Could thought have flickered in forms we cannot recognize, not made of bone but of gel or current or rhythm? Could life have reached for complexity, and found it, then lost it again? Maybe. Or maybe what came before bones was never meant to build. Maybe it sang instead, or drifted, or danced in colonies across tides we'll never feel. Maybe what came before bones was entirely different from what came after, not lesser, not failed, just different. And if so, then how do we begin to ask the right questions? We look not for bones, but for patterns, for rhythms in the strata, for anomalies in the isotopes, for sudden changes in climate or sediment, unexplained by simple geologic processes. We look for interruptions, not of stone, but of silence, because silence too can speak. And the silence of the Precambrian is immense. We often imagine the Earth's past as a rising curve, simple to complex, soft to hard, aimless to aware. But perhaps that curve isn't a straight line. Perhaps it loops. Perhaps it pulses. Perhaps life flares into complexity and then softens again. Like breath, like tide, like sleep. And if something extraordinary did rise before the Cambrian, before the trilobites, before bones, then maybe its great sin wasn't failure. Maybe it simply didn't leave anything we would recognize. We who are made of skeletons and teeth. We who think in tools and cities. What if something lived here that didn't need those things? What if their history wasn't written in objects, but in behavior, in migration or song or light? The Earth has hosted many experiments. Some succeed for a while. Others vanish not because they were flawed, but because the planet itself changed. Oceans turned to stone. Atmospheres shifted. Sunlight dimmed or thickened. Nothing lasts forever, not even the context needed for survival. And so, what lived before bones may have simply lost its moment, its time, and left us not a trail, but a question. A question older than bones, older than shells, older than the idea of record-keeping itself. And if that question has no answer, perhaps it was never meant to. Perhaps it exists only to be asked, again and again. So we ask it. We ask it not just with science, but with wonder. Not just with tools, but with dreams. What lived in the time before bones? What passed unseen, unheard, unpreserved? And if we've already forgotten it, could we forget again? Could something right now be living, thinking, rising in a form that we, too, will never remember? And if it is, would we even know how to look? Because to look is to remember there is more beneath us than fossils. There is time, and time hides everything eventually. Which brings us to the quiet puzzle at the edge of science and story, the strange thought that if something advanced once walked this earth before us, we may never know it through ruins or monuments or metal. We may only know it through what geologists now call technofossils, not fossils of flesh but of process. Not remains, but residue. You see, the earth does not preserve the familiar signs of civilization kindly. Skyscrapers collapse. Roads crack, fade, and vanish beneath creeping soil. Entire cities can be lost to vines, to flood, to the slow melt of wind and rain. In just a few thousand years, even the most resilient human structures are reduced to silence. Now stretch that silence to 1,000,000 years. 10 million, 100 million. What's left? Not the buildings, not the bones, but maybe the signal. A signal buried in layers of stone. Imagine for a moment a species not human but thoughtful. Not like us but clever. A species that rose in some forgotten epoch, long before the dinosaurs, long before even the first vertebrates. A species that harnessed energy, transformed its environment, altered the chemistry of its world. Now imagine all that evidence erased, consumed by time, by subduction, by erosion, by the unrelenting churn of the planet's skin. And still, perhaps, a few traces remain. Not artifacts, but anomalies. Carbon spikes, synthetic compounds, unnatural concentrations of rare elements. Changes in the isotopic ratios of oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen. Geological fingerprints, left not by tectonic forces or volcanic bursts, but by something intentional. This is the heart of the Silurian hypothesis, a thought experiment posed by scientists Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt, a gentle wondering of whether any signs of a pre-human technological species could have survived deep time. Not because they believed in such a civilization, but because the act of asking opens doors in the mind. Because asking teaches us how to look. And what would we look for? We'd look for things that nature does not do easily. Plastics, synthetic molecules, long-lived radionuclides, shifts in sediment consistent with rapid climate change, widespread industrialization, or chemical manufacturing. We'd look for sudden, planet-wide patterns, layers of ash, smog, or soot unlinked to known volcanism. We'd look for the quiet unnatural. The Earth's strata record more than just natural rhythms. They record interruptions. The end of the dinosaurs, for example, is marked by a thin band of iridium-rich clay found across the globe. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids. A calling card of sorts. The fingerprint of an impact. So too we leave fingerprints. Since the mid-20th century, humans have created technofossils of our own. Plastiglomerates, rocks fused with plastic. Concrete, aluminum alloys, synthetic textiles, nuclear fallout isotopes. These will persist for tens of thousands, perhaps millions, of years. Our signal is already being written into the Earth's memory, layer by layer. But now we look backward. Could something else have left a signal too? Something subtle, something easily mistaken. Could a species have burned fossil fuels not unlike us, leaving behind a spike in carbon-12 and carbon-13 ratios? Could they have mined rare metals, built machines, altered coastlines, warmed the air? Could they have changed the soil, redirected rivers, cultivated or cleared forests, and left behind a signature of ecological reorganization? Maybe. Or maybe they used materials we can't detect. Maybe they lived lightly, or left before the planet recycled their record. Maybe they were swallowed by a subduction zone, or lived in a time whose crust has long since melted back into the Earth's mantle. And yet we still wonder, because the deep past is not closed. It's just hard to reach. And the longer we look at the rock layers, the more we see signs of complexity. Repeating rhythms, abrupt climate swings, unexpected mineral concentrations. Some of these have natural explanations. Some don't. Take the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a sudden global warming event 56 million years ago. It left behind a sharp carbon isotope excursion, ocean acidification, and massive ecological upheaval. No one knows what caused it. Methane release? Volcanism? Or something else? Could a civilization, not human but thinking, have played a role? We don't know. We may never know. But the idea itself is not absurd. Because the only thing more vast than the fossil record is its gaps. And within those gaps, the mind begins to hum. It hums not with proof, but with possibility. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. It wonders, if we leave a geological echo, why couldn't others have done the same? If we can trigger a mass extinction through our actions, what if someone or something once did too? And if their story ended, what ended it? Perhaps they vanished by choice, or by catastrophe, or simply by time, folded into the quiet, like dust into stone. Because even technofossils, strange and stubborn as they are, fade. The Earth is relentless in its forgetting. Even now, tectonic plates slide over each other, grinding down the oldest chapters. The ocean floor, no older than 200 million years, is born and destroyed in slow cycles, erasing any ancient tale it might carry. We are left, then, with windows, with fragments, and with the haunting idea that if a civilization once rose and fell in the deep past, we might only ever find its shadow. A whisper in the rock, a trace in the chemistry, a silence that feels slightly shaped. And so we keep looking, not for proof, but for patterns. Not for monuments, but for messages carved not in language, but in geology. Plastic seam, carbon shift, a strange trace of heat. Because if Earth holds memory, it may not always remember clearly, but it remembers enough to make us pause. And if we can leave behind technofossils in barely a century, what might have been left by something older, deeper, quieter? Something the Earth tried to forget, but couldn't completely erase. And yet, most things are erased. Not with fire, not with flood, but slowly, quietly, with time. Entropy does not scream. It whispers. It doesn't strike, it softens. It smooths edges, unravels order, wears down intention. It is the long, invisible tide that pulls everything, buildings, thoughts, languages, cities, back into the dark. Entropy is not destruction. It's dissolution, the quiet loss of pattern, the inevitable drift from form to formlessness. Perfect machine rusting, a statue crumbling grain by grain, a story, once told with clarity, becoming a blur of forgotten words. And Earth is a planet made of entropy. Over deep time, mountains sink. Rivers change course. Forests become stone. Oceans become deserts, and deserts, in time, return to sea. Nothing stays. Everything moves. Slowly, yes, too slowly to notice in a single breath. But in geologic time, the decay is relentless. The Earth does not resist it. It allows it, participates. And we, whatever we are, however long we last, are not immune. We imagine collapse through drama. Fire, flood, war, extinction. But what if the greatest danger isn't a sudden end, but a slow one? What if civilizations aren't erased by catastrophe, but by forgetting? Entropy is what happens when a roof caves in, and no one rebuilds it. When records fade, and no one rewrites them. When meanings are lost, and no one remembers why they mattered. Could entire civilizations slip away this way? Could they rise, flourish, explore, wonder, and then, slowly, soften into unrecognizability? This happened before. We've seen how even recent human cultures disappear without trace. Wooden villages swallowed by jungle. Languages extinguished in a generation. Empires collapsed and buried under new ones. Now imagine that same process, but over 1,000,000 years. 10 million. 100. What if it's not just a possibility, but a pattern? Entropy doesn't erase evenly. It wears down the soft first. The voices, the textiles, the stories, then the bricks, the tools, the names. Eventually, even the stone forgets. And the deeper you go in Earth's crust, the clearer this becomes. The record thins. The clarity fades. Fewer fossils. More unconformities. More places where the planet simply didn't keep the memory. There is no malice in this. Just indifference. Or perhaps a mercy. Maybe forgetting is part of how the Earth stays alive. Letting go of what no longer fits. Making room for the next song. And yet, we still wonder what we've lost. Could entropy be the reason we haven't found anyone else? Not just on Earth, but anywhere? Not because they didn't exist, but because time over long enough scales devours all signals, all footprints, even light. Maybe the silence of the universe is not a sign of absence, but of erosion. If a civilization rose on Earth 1 billion years ago, used energy, built things, tried to remember itself, what would be left now? Would any artifact survive 1 billion years of continental drift, chemical weathering, cosmic radiation, meteor impacts, tectonic burial? Probably not. The fossil record itself is barely that old. Most crust that ancient is gone or remade. So maybe there were others. Maybe they came and went, not in explosions, but in fade-outs. Maybe entropy, not extinction, is the great filter. Not the dramatic fall, but the gradual vanishing. And if so, what does that mean for us? Perhaps the question isn't whether we'll leave a mark, but how long it will last. Perhaps our story will be told not through monuments, but through residues. Perhaps our greatest legacy won't be what we build, but what we alter. The isotopes we shift, the atmosphere we warm, the extinction we cause, and perhaps even those traces will eventually be lost. Because even memory decays, even the deepest carving fades. And maybe that's not a tragedy. Maybe it's the rhythm of a living world. Nothing stays, everything softens, everything returns. And yet, if entropy always wins, if forgetting is the natural end of all things, then what becomes of meaning? What becomes of the urge to be remembered? Maybe that, too, is part of the pattern. A bright, brief spark of defiance, just before the tide takes it back. But even in that soft surrender, there is beauty. Because even as we vanish, we ask, we wonder, we look at the layers and whisper, was someone here before us? And even as the answer fades, the question lingers. And maybe that's enough. Maybe what lasts isn't the record, but the reaching, the way we listen, the way we lean toward the past, even as it slips away. And if we lean gently enough, we may hear what comes next, but only if we learn to listen where the world no longer speaks. And perhaps nowhere is the silence more profound than in the depths of the Precambrian. A stretch of time so vast, so shadowed, that even Earth itself seems hesitant to recall it. This era, which spans more than 4 billion years, occupies nearly 90% of the planet's history. And yet, it remains a mystery wrapped in quiet, dark seas, molten crusts, drifting microcontinents, and almost nothing we would recognize as life. Not because there was nothing, but because whatever lived did not leave bones. The fossil record as we know it begins with the Cambrian explosion, a relatively sudden burst of visible complexity, where animals with shells, spines, and structure appeared in the oceans. Trilobites, brachiopods, early coral, forms we can see and touch and categorize. But what came before? What pulsed in the dark, nutrient-rich waters of the Precambrian, when Earth was young and unstable, and everything was still becoming? We know there was life. Stromatolites tell us that. These layered colonies of cyanobacteria are some of the oldest living traces we've found, over 3.5 billion years old. They breathed, multiplied, built shallow reef-like mats that still exist today in quiet tidal pools. They shaped the very atmosphere, exhaling oxygen into a world not yet ready to hold it. But was that all? Were these simple blue-green architects the only inhabitants of a world more ancient than fossils? Or could there have been something more? Something soft, something strange, something that moved with the current or through the silt, or in networks we would not recognize as life at all. The Precambrian Ocean was unlike any sea today, thick with minerals, rich with dissolved metals, low in oxygen, teeming with invisible reactions. Life here would have evolved not toward sight or strength or symmetry, but toward survival in a realm of pressure, heat, and chemistry. Could intelligence emerge in such a place? Not in the way we know it, not with hands or fire or language, but perhaps in some other form, a slow awareness distributed through colonies, a biochemical intelligence woven into fluid systems, communication through pulses or gradients or patterns too alien for us to decode. Could thought exist without voice? Could purpose exist without structure? We have no fossil record to say yes, but absence is not proof of nothing. It is only proof of silence. And silence is not empty. Sometimes it's where the oldest things sleep. Much of the Precambrian record has been destroyed by time. The crust was thinner then, more active. Tectonic activity constantly remixed the surface. Subduction swallowed evidence. Erosion dissolved stories. Even the rocks that remain, the banded iron formations, the ancient gneiss and quartzite, whisper only in geochemical riddles. We are left with windows, narrow, murky, incomplete. In Greenland, zircon crystals speak of liquid water 4 billion years ago. In Australia, microfossils suggest life stirring in shadowy mats. In Canada, graphite deposits carry isotopic signs that hint, softly, cautiously, at biology. But in between, gaps. Enormous, unanswered gaps. There are entire eons, hundreds of millions of years long, where we simply don't know what happened. Not because nothing happened, but because the Earth turned the page too soon. The ink hadn't dried, and so we wonder, what lives vanished before they could fossilize? What forms of consciousness bloomed and dissolved before the Cambrian ever opened its eyes? Could there have been something in that dark sea, fragile, brief, and brilliant, that reached toward complexity, and then receded? We tend to think of evolution as a steady climb, but it's not. It's uneven, chaotic, full of leaps and stalls and reversals. Complexity does not guarantee survival. Intelligence does not promise permanence. Perhaps the Precambrian held its own experiments, some that never left the ocean floor, some that failed before they could replicate, and maybe, just maybe, one that reached awareness and left behind nothing but altered chemistry and a brief change in current. Maybe that's why we look to anomalies, unexplained carbon shifts, curious metal deposits, oxidation events that don't quite match the models. Not because they prove anything, but because they suggest something. A handprint smeared by rain, a voice half heard through water. And if something did rise and fall before the age of bones, would we ever know? Or would we walk over it daily, blind to what we've lost? The Precambrian is not a blank slate. It is a palimpsest, a scroll rewritten so many times that the original text is barely visible beneath the scars. But sometimes, when the light is just right, and the question is just gentle enough, we catch a glimpse of what may have once been written there. And the glimpse is enough. Enough to ask. Enough to wonder. Enough to lean closer into the silence that cradles deep time. Because sometimes, it's not about finding the answers, but about learning how to hear the questions that still echo. And as we listen, really listen, to the dark sea of Earth's first story, a new possibility begins to form. Not of what we can see, but of what we might have missed. And if the ocean once held something more than algae and drifting cells, then perhaps what came next, the rising continents, the roaring beasts, the civilizations of stone and steel, are not the beginning at all, but just the surface, and the deeper truths still sleep, far below, waiting to be remembered. But memory becomes harder to hold when the ground itself does not stay still. The earth beneath us seems solid, dependable, unmoving. But over deep time it is anything but. Continents drift, oceans open and close, mountains rise, collapse, rise again. The crust of this planet floats atop a deeper tide, tectonic plates shifting slowly but relentlessly, carrying everything above them like pages in a book constantly rearranging its chapters. And before Pangaea, that great supercontinent we learn about in school, Earth's surface was something else entirely. A stranger world, fractured, fragmented, unfamiliar. The continents we know today were scattered, isolated, adrift across ancient seas. Some collided, merged, then broke apart again. Others disappeared entirely, subducted into the mantle, melted beyond recognition. We are taught to see continents as fixed, but they are not. They are travelers. They are drifters on a slow, powerful current of heat and pressure. And when land moves, it does not always carry its history with it. Instead, it buries it. Imagine a place, a vast island or a small continent, rich with forests, rivers, perhaps even life that had learned to build or speak or dream. And now imagine that land, after millions of years, drawn toward the edge of a tectonic plate. Slowly, silently, it begins to descend down into the subduction zone, into the place where crust is recycled. Nothing dramatic, just gravity and time. Bit by bit, the land is pulled into the deep, compressed, heated, folded, until what was once surface becomes part of the Earth's interior. Buildings, bones, rivers, roots, all drawn into silence, into forgetfulness. This is not imagination. It is process. It happens. And it has happened over and over again. There are continents we cannot even name. Geological ghosts. Ancient landmasses like Rodinia, Nuna, and Gondwana, each preceding Pangaea, each lost and remade. Some left behind traces. Mineral belts, fault lines, rock signatures in distant places that once touched. Others left nothing. They vanished beneath ocean crust, their edges blurred beyond certainty. So what might have sunk with them? What stories, what environments, what fragile attempts at life were folded into the deep before they could fossilize, before they could be seen? We know this. The sea swallows land, and not all land returns. When continents were strangers, the Earth's climate, chemistry, and geography were in constant flux. Ice ages came and went. Oxygen levels shifted. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of meters. Entire ecosystems vanished without leaving clear markers. And in those periods of isolation, when landmasses floated far apart, life evolved in seclusion. Alone. Unique. Possibly experimental. Could something extraordinary have emerged in one of these isolated places? Something intelligent? Something strange? Not for long. Not forever. Just briefly. Long enough to build, perhaps. Or organize. Or remember. Long enough to leave a trace. But not long enough to survive subduction. Not long enough to endure the crushing folds of the mantle. We tend to search for ancient civilizations where land is still land, where we can dig, brush away soil, uncover stone foundations. But what about the places that were never meant to last? What about the lands that drifted beneath the crust and never came back? The ocean hides so much. Submerged plateaus like Zealandia, nearly the size of Australia, remain mostly beneath the sea. Lost microcontinents scattered across the Indian Ocean. Sunken ridges, drowned arches, scattered island chains that were once connected but now lie shattered, half erased by water. Could one of these have been home to something we no longer recognize? Could entire chapters of Earth's memory lie underwater, or worse, beneath the ocean floor itself, beyond reach? We don't know. But we do know this. The surface we see today is not the same surface that was here 500 million years ago, or 700, or a billion. We are walking atop strangers, stranger lands, stranger times, stranger lives, and in some places the crust is thick, stable enough to preserve what it held. But in others it has been flipped, broken, swallowed. So the silence is not only in time. It is in space. It is in place. And the farther back we look, the more Earth's geography becomes a blur. The coastlines change. The maps dissolve. The anchors of certainty drift out of reach. We are left with questions. What might have lived when continents were strangers? What might have been built or dreamed or attempted, and then lost not in fire but in movement, not in war but in wandering? And if Earth forgets not because it chooses to, but because it moves, then how many stories have been buried not in dust, but in stone? Stone that now lies kilometers below the surface. Stone that was once sky and soil and life. Maybe one day we'll learn how to read those deeper layers. Maybe one day we'll find a mark, a pattern too precise, a chemical trace too strange, and realize that something once lived, once acted in a time before we had maps for it. But until then, we keep looking. Not for cities, but for scars. Not for monuments, but for movement. Because sometimes, it's not what stands tall that tells the story. It's what sank without a sound. But sometimes sound isn't needed. Sometimes, the most enduring signals aren't left in monuments or ruins, but in chemistry. Quiet shifts in the Earth's composition that linger long after wind and water have washed everything else away. This is where scientists now look for whispers. Not in artifacts, but in isotopes. Every atom tells a story. And sometimes the story isn't what it should be. There are layers of Earth, deep, ancient, subtle, where the ratios of elements don't quite make sense. Where carbon appears in strange concentrations. Where metals seem too abundant. Where radioactive decay doesn't match the expected timelines. These are not always errors. Often they are clues. Clues that something happened. Something unaccounted for. Something that may not have been natural. Geologists call these anomalies. Departures from the expected. And they study them with care using mass spectrometers, radiometric dating, isotope fingerprinting. Because in a world where everything changes, isotopes are the long keepers. They endure. They don't lie, but they do require interpretation. And interpretation, like memory, can be fallible or incomplete. So we wonder, What could cause a sudden spike in carbon-13, or a thin band of rare earth metals, or a drop in oxygen isotopes that stretches across a continent? Volcanoes, perhaps, asteroid impacts, but sometimes the patterns feel different. Not chaotic like nature, but precise, repeated, patterned, as if someone or something was shaping the Earth not by accident but by design. Could a civilization have left such a mark? One that isn't etched in stone, but embedded in chemistry? Consider carbon. When we burn fossil fuels, we release massive amounts of carbon into the atmosphere, particularly light carbon, carbon-12, which plants prefer to absorb. This skews the natural ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-13, leaving behind a chemical signature. A spike, to tell. Future geologists, millions of years from now, might read this layer in the rock and say, something was burning fuel here. Something changed the air. Now imagine a similar spike, deep in the past. A layer of sediment from 250 million years ago, showing rapid carbon release, faster than volcanoes alone could manage. Or trace metals, usually found in electronics, appearing in ancient clays. Or isotopes associated with nuclear reactions, sitting quietly in strata that should have been untouched by technology. These are not just fantasy. Some of them have already been found. But science is cautious, and rightly so. Nature has many ways of surprising us. And correlation is not causation. A spike may be real and still be natural. A metal may be out of place, and still explained by weather, water, or mineral exchange. Still, the questions linger, because the echoes don't always sound like accidents. In some layers, we see sudden temperature increases, global warming events that resemble our own. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, for example, 56 million years ago. A rapid rise in temperature, a massive carbon isotope excursion, widespread species loss. No known asteroid, no confirmed volcanic chain, just change. Fast, severe, global. Was it natural? Most likely. But could it have been helped? Could a civilization, long before us, have driven a similar transformation, releasing carbon, altering ecosystems, setting off a chain reaction they couldn't control? And if they did, would that be all we'd find? Would the only evidence of their rise and fall be a thin black line in the rock? A whisper in the isotopes? It's possible, because entropy strips away almost everything else. Plastics degrade, buildings collapse, records burn or dissolve. But isotopes endure. They are the fingerprints of process, the breath of machines, the long exhale of industry. They don't preserve intent, but they hint at cause. And so, scientists have begun to look more closely, not just for proof of our own Anthropocene, the epoch we are currently writing, but for signs of others, other epochs, other rises, other industrial ages that may have come and gone, leaving only strange chemistry behind. They study sediments for technetium and plutonium, isotopes with no natural origin. They examine glacial ice for trapped gases. They scan cores from the ocean floor for sudden shifts in rare metals. Cobalt, palladium, neodymium, metals that don't drift alone. And every so often, they find something odd. Not definitive, not headline-worthy, but odd. A hiccup in the data, a whisper that doesn't fit. These are the echoes we follow, not because we expect answers, but because we respect the possibility that Earth may have hosted more than we remember. That it may have seen not just life, but lives that changed it. Lives that left a mark too subtle to see, too quiet to feel, but not too faint to measure. And if those civilizations once existed brief, soft, undone by their own tools, then perhaps we are not unique. Perhaps we are only the latest iteration, the newest voice to stir the isotopes, to shape the chemistry, to paint the planet with intention. And perhaps, like those before us, we will vanish too. And what will remain? Not monuments, not myths, but signals. A change in the carbon curve, a strange metal seam, a breath of isotope in an ancient stone. And someone or something will find it far in the future, and wonder, not who we were, but what we did. And the whisper will continue, across time, across stone, across silence. The echoes reach us, faint, fractured, embedded in the Earth's deep layers. But not all signals arrive in chemistry or isotopes. Some drift closer to something else, something more haunting, more human: dust. We think of dust as the end of a thing, the fine remainder of what was once structure, once living, once whole. It coats forgotten places, clings to ruins, settles on windowsills like memory waiting to be seen. But dust isn't just decay. Sometimes, it's what's left behind when purpose has faded. Sandstone, ash, iron. These are the minerals of Earth's long memory, carved by water, compacted by time. But what if, somewhere beneath it all, there is a layer of dust that is different? Not naturally formed, but intentionally created. Not scattered by wind, but shaped by hands. The ghost of something that once imagined, once designed. A civilization that rose not to leave monuments but molecules. And now it is dust. Dust that once dreamed. Imagine sifting through ancient sediment, dry, silent, pressed into stone over hundreds of millions of years. You find a thin seam darker than the rest. It doesn't match the local geology. It holds microparticles of glass, or strangely fused metals, or carbon compounds not known in nature. It is easy to overlook, easy to explain away, but something about it feels deliberate. Could this be the echo of fire used not for warmth, but for creation? Could this be ash from a forge, or the residue of materials we no longer recognize? Could this be the dust of cities ground down to memory, cities that stood not in myth, but in moments far too ancient for our maps? Civilizations leave waste. That is their signature. Ours will be plastic, concrete, steel, and radiation. But what if an older one, softer than ours, left behind dust? Particulate matter, airborne intention, not monuments of stone but particles of thought. We do this too. We burn, we grind, we refine, and in the end, what escapes us often becomes dust. Traces we can't control, pollution we don't notice, particles that settle on rooftops and oceans and snowfields. Perhaps that is our legacy, not what we build, but what drifts from it. And perhaps that was true before us. Perhaps the dreaming dust already sleeps beneath the crust, compressed, altered, waiting. What makes this idea so difficult is not the science, it's the humility. The willingness to accept that what we seek may not look the way we expect. That the legacy of intelligence might not be pyramids or satellites, but a dark band of soot beneath a limestone cliff. A whisper, not a monument. A residue, not a relic. And if we begin to look at dust differently, not as something that once lived, but as something that once intended, then the whole earth becomes a palimpsest. A manuscript rewritten over and over, each new layer burying the last. The writing fades, the meaning blurs, but under the right light, some letters remain. This is where geology becomes almost poetic. The way fine particles settle in still water. The way they compress under heat, forming lines like sentences. Each layer a pause, a breath, a moment that almost meant something. Almost, because dust can deceive too. Nature makes strange things. Glass in lightning strikes, spheres in volcanic ash, metallic inclusions in ancient sediment. Not all anomalies are messages, but some might be, and so we keep asking, not with certainty, but with wonder. Could a fine band of ancient silt be more than just erosion? Could the pale powder in a forgotten strata hold the shape of vanished intention? And if so, how would we know? We search for pattern, for repetition, for traces of systems, because dust that dreams leaves trails, even faint ones, concentrates, collects where there was once purpose, and perhaps somewhere far below, there is a layer not yet found. A quiet bed of matter, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be recognized not as byproduct, but as aftermath, of choice, of craft, of life. Maybe it was never meant to last. Maybe even they, whoever they were, knew that in the end, everything becomes dust. But maybe they also knew that dust is not the end. Not if someone is listening. not if someone remembers how to look. And as we run our fingers across the stone, brushing away the years, the weight, the silence, maybe we'll feel something there, something soft, something faint, something that once dreamed. And dreams, too, can fossilize, not in bone, not in stone, but in story, because not all memory lives in the earth. Some of it lives in us, in language, in rhythm, in the tales we pass down through time without knowing where they began. Stories are softer than fossils, more fragile, more prone to change, but sometimes they last. And just like shells pressed into limestone, some of them carry patterns older than we realize. We think of fossils as physical, the shape of a ribcage, the curl of an ammonite, the imprint of a fern. But what if memory can fossilize too? What if knowledge, long after its origin is gone, can still echo through the way we dream, the way we build, the way we repeat certain myths again and again? Could memory be preserved not in the ground, but in culture? Could it survive the end of civilizations by embedding itself in story? It's a quiet possibility, but one that grows louder the longer we listen to ancient tales. Flood myths, for example, appear in dozens of disconnected cultures. Babylon, India, Mesoamerica, the Arctic, the Pacific Islands, always the same rhythm. A great flood, a lost world, a few survivors, something precious preserved. The story shifts, of course, different names, different gods, but the bones of the myth remain, like a skeleton pressed into cultural sediment. Some scientists suggest these stories may trace back to real events. Post-glacial sea level rise, sudden floods after ice dams broke, coastlines swallowed as the last ice age receded. And if memory can survive that long thousands of years, then maybe it can survive even longer. Maybe myth is a form of fossilization. Not accurate, not literal, but rhythmic, repetitive, intentional, something that remembers even when it forgets. Think of oral traditions, passed down across hundreds of generations. Think of symbols that appear in places too far apart to explain easily. Spirals, suns, serpents, great birds that descend from the sky, circular calendars. Hidden knowledge stored in geometry, in structure, in ritual. Could these be cultural fossils? And if so, whose memory are they preserving? Ours? Or someone else's? The line between invention and remembrance can be thin. Perhaps we didn't create the myths. Perhaps we inherited them, changed them, wore them down like rivers wearing down stone. But still, their shapes remain. A memory of something. Maybe we no longer remember what, but perhaps we remember that something was lost, that something came before. And maybe that's all a fossil is, a shape left behind when the substance is gone. We know this happens in stone. Could it happen in civilization? When a culture dies, when its libraries burn, its temples fall, its language fades, does some part of it survive anyway? In the next people, in the next idea, in a song that seems older than it should be, in a pattern carved into rock not for utility, but remembrance. When we build, we repeat. Arches, domes, pyramids, circles. Perhaps not because we copy directly, but because the memory of those forms is fossilized in the collective mind. Deep in the unconscious where culture and biology entwine. Memory as instinct, architecture as inheritance, ritual as residue. We don't know when memory ends and myth begins, but we sense that line exists. And sometimes, when the world feels especially quiet, we wonder if something on the other side of that line is calling back. Maybe that's why we build stories into stone, to keep them from blowing away, to fossilize them, not in limestone, but in meaning. And perhaps that's what language does best. It layers, compresses, it distills. Words become phrases. Phrases become symbols. Symbols become myths. And what begins as lived experience ends as metaphor. But the shape remains, like a trilobite under shale. If a civilization once lived before us, far before bones or fire or writing, how might it leave memory behind? Not through objects, but through rhythms, through archetypes, through the same dreams told in different voices. We've always imagined we're alone in time, that we are the beginning of the story. But maybe we're just the ones who came after. The ones who caught the echo, not the song. The ones who built from memory, not invention. And what if memory is more persistent than we thought? What if it waits? What if it loops? The fossil record is not complete. It's patchy, uneven. It doesn't preserve everything, only what the earth allows. Maybe cultural memory is the same. Only some stories fossilize. Only some ideas last. But when they do, they speak. Not clearly, not loudly, but with enough weight to stir something ancient in the listener. A flicker, a sense of return, a soft, strange recognition. And when we feel it, we don't know whether we're remembering something real or simply something true, because even imagined things can feel ancient. And maybe that's what the Earth's memory really is. Not a list of facts, but a collection of feelings buried in stone, in dust, in story, waiting for us to ask the right question, waiting to be heard, waiting to rise again, not as facts, but as fossils, not of bodies, but of meaning. And if meaning can survive the fall of worlds, then maybe nothing is ever truly lost. Maybe it just takes a different shape. And that shape, however small, however broken, is enough to begin again. But sometimes what began never returned. Sometimes it sank, because even memory has a weight. And in the end, the sea swallows everything. The oceans are Earth's great archivists, but also its most secretive. They keep things, yes, but not in ways we can easily read. They bury, they shift, they press. And over time, they forget. Not deliberately, but by pressure, by current, by the slow fall of sediment through silence. If something once stood where waves now rise, it is no longer standing. If a city once glowed beneath stars, where now only algae bloom and fish drift through silence, then all that remains of it may be sealed beneath 100 meters of mud. The sea does not preserve what we think it does. It unbuilds, it rearranges, and it forgets. But the forgetting is slow, and in that slowness, there may still be time to ask, could the ocean floor hold the ruins of places never written in history? Could it hold cities that once rose, not mythically, not metaphorically, but literally, with structure, with order, with meaning? We know that human civilizations have already been lost this way. Entire coastlines swallowed when the Ice Age ended, the sea rising by over 100 meters in just a few thousand years. Lands that were once walkable are now ocean floor. Doggerland in the North Sea, once rich with life, now silent. The Sunda Shelf, once a vast Southeast Asian plain, now drowned. If so much can vanish in mere millennia, what might have disappeared in millions? What might have lived, loved, and left no trace beneath waves that are now thousands of meters deep? Beneath the silt, beneath the basalt, beneath the trembling of tectonic plates, is it possible there are cities? Not like ours, perhaps. Not skyscrapers or subways, but places of presence, of arrangement, of deliberate making, places once filled with light and sound, and now filled only with sediment. Even today, the ocean floor is largely unknown. We have mapped the surface of Mars more clearly than our own abyssal plains. Vast swaths of seafloor remain dark to us. Too deep, too cold, too layered in mystery. And yet, sometimes the sea gives hints. Strange geometric formations, aligned stones, anomalous sonar returns, features that don't fit with volcanic activity or seafloor spreading. Most are explained eventually: lava flows, gas eruptions, natural formations mistaken for architecture. But not all. And even the explanations are sometimes uncomfortable. Because what if the lines we dismiss as coincidental were once walls? What if the terraces were once steps? What if the smooth plain we call a plateau was once a city square, brushed clean by 1,000 storms? It's not proof. It's not even theory. It's a question. But questions, too, have weight. And when asked in the right place, they stir things deeper than knowledge. They stir longing. Longing to know if we are truly the first to shape the earth with intention, or if we are only the first to remember doing so. The ocean, for all its depth, is thin on time. Its crust is young, rarely older than 200 million years. The process of seafloor spreading means the oldest parts of the ocean are slowly consumed at the edges, folded back into the planet's interior. If cities once stood in the truly ancient seas, 1 billion years ago, 500 million, they would be gone entirely. Melted, forgotten not by water, but by the planet itself. But more recent ones? On continental shelves, now drowned? On lost islands, on rift fragments, on submerged microcontinents? Maybe, maybe not. But even the no leaves room for wonder. Because the silence down there is not empty. It is full of waiting, full of questions held in the cold. And we are just beginning to descend. The technology to scan, to map, to listen has only just arrived. And as we sweep the depths with sound and satellites, we may find things we weren't taught to expect. Not Atlantis, perhaps, but structure, pattern, the ghost of arrangement. Not proof of a past we can name, but evidence of a presence we've overlooked. And if we find even one place that suggests intentional shaping, one formation, one alignment, one anomaly that resists dismissal, it will ask more than it answers. It will remind us that the sea has always hidden its truths behind beauty, that it gives back only what it chooses, and that whatever once lived beneath the waves may still be sleeping there, not in air, not in stone, but in silt, in shadow, in silence. And if we are patient, if we learn to listen in sonar, in sediment, in subtle disruptions of the deep, perhaps we'll find that the oceans too remember. Even if they've forgotten the names, some memories still smolder. Not in stone, not in silt, but in carbon. Ghosts, left behind in black seams that run through hills and valleys, mountain flanks and mine shafts. Ancient forests turned to fossil fuel, to coal, to peat, to carbon locked beneath the surface. A record of sunlight caught by leaves that no longer exist, of trunks that reach toward skies now erased, of life that bloomed and fell. Coal is not just fuel. It is memory, compressed. A forest made solid by time and pressure. And the coal beds we find, rich, dark, flammable, are among Earth's oldest records of life's abundance. Most formed during the Carboniferous and Permian periods, over 300 million years ago, when vast wetlands and swamps teemed with giant ferns, horsetails, towering lycopsids, trees unlike ours, air heavy with oxygen, insects the size of hawks, and then extinction, a long dying, a world gone still. The trees fell, the swamps dried, the pressure came, and with it the silence. But in that silence, a question flickers. Could something else have burned before the forests fell? Could fire, deliberate, planned, artificial, have touched these trees not just as a byproduct of lightning, but as a tool? Could someone have harnessed heat before heat harnessed them? We think of coal as nature's timeline, a slow consequence. But what if, tucked within those blackened seams, there are anomalies, signs of combustion that shouldn't be there? Heat-altered minerals, oxidized metals, burn patterns that whisper of intention. There are places where seams show evidence of ancient burning. Paleobotanists have found signs of spontaneous combustion, where coal ignites underground from pressure and oxygen. But what if some of that fire wasn't spontaneous? What if it was structured? What if something sparked it, not randomly but with design? The idea is almost absurd. And yet, if a civilization rose before the Permian, before mammals, before even reptiles claimed the land, and if it had tools, energy, industry, would it not leave a trace in the carbon? And would that trace look like us? Or would it be fainter, more fragile? A thin crust of ash between layers of peat? A spike in carbon isotopes not caused by volcanoes or methane releases, but by fire-controlled, fire-used. We have found fire's fingerprints in other places. Charcoal in caves, hearths in human settlements, ash in ancient soils. But the older the layers, the less certain the meaning. And coal beds are old. They stretch back to a time when Earth was unrecognizable. Continents shaped differently. The sun slightly dimmer. Air thicker, greener, strange. It was a world on the verge of change. A world lush with life, but teetering. Could that teetering have been helped? Could someone or something have pushed it? Burned too much? Taken too much? We know our own fires have shifted the planet's balance. Carbon released from coal and oil changes the atmosphere, raises the oceans, alters climate. What if that happened before? What if the carbon spikes we see from the end of the Permian aren't only volcanic? What if they were, in part, industrial? The rock record does not give answers freely. It resists certainty, but it leaves patterns. And in the patterns we see hints. Bursts of carbon, oxygen dips, mass extinctions, sudden heat, events that changed the course of life. Some we blame on asteroids, some on volcanoes, but some remain unexplained. And the coal remains. Burnable memory. Fossilized forests that remember what it felt like to fall. If something once lit fires before the Permian, if they cleared the trees, fed the flames, reached for energy and change, then perhaps their greatest legacy is the same as ours, the carbon itself. And perhaps their greatest silence was how that fire ended, not in triumph, but in forgetting, in forests that returned to root, in ferns that grew over their ruins, in peat that closed over whatever was left, until all that remained was coal. And now we burn it again, releasing not just energy but echoes of suns long gone, of forests long buried, of intentions long erased, and maybe, just maybe, of others who once lit fires and watched them grow. But what if fire never came? What if intelligence, full, complex, self-aware intelligence, once stirred in a world untouched by metal, by flame, by the tools we now call progress? Would we ever know? Could a civilization rise not on the bones of industry, but on something softer, something that leaves behind almost nothing at all? We measure history in metals. The Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the steel and silicon of our own time. We assume that intelligence and metallurgy are inseparable, that to build, to rise, to shape a world, one must first dig into the earth and pull from it the gleam of something harder, something sharper. But intelligence doesn't need fire. It doesn't need it only needs time and curiosity. So what if, long before the first smelting hearth, before copper was coaxed from stone, a thinking species bloomed, one that never learned to forge? One that never needed to. Not all cultures build in stone. Not all inventions require heat. What if they wove instead? Grew their homes like coral? Sang their tools into form? What if they communicated through chemical trails or gestures or sound waves too low for us to hear? What if their world, intelligent, vast, alive, was made entirely of perishable things? Fiber, clay, bark, bone, resin, light. Nothing we could find in a fossil. Nothing we could recognize in stone. Because nature erases the soft first. A house of wood, abandoned, disappears in decades. A city of reed dissolves with a flood. A culture that never carved into rock leaves nothing for us to see. We call that absence prehistory. But perhaps it's not a lack of history. Perhaps it's simply a lack of metal. Without steel, there are no nails to remain. Without copper, no wires. Without plastic, no waste. But what if they built anyway? What if they passed knowledge not through writing, but through memory, repetition, rhythm? A civilization encoded in voice, in gesture, in the folding of leaves, the twisting of vine. What if they knew things we've forgotten, not in terms of progress but in terms of balance? To live in a world without metal might mean living with less, but also disturbing less, leaving fewer scars, walking softly across the planet's skin, and in doing so, disappearing completely. Could such a people, soft, brilliant, ephemeral, have walked this world millions of years ago? Could they have risen in a rainforest now gone? Along coastlines since drowned? In valleys where tectonics have erased every trace? We wouldn't know where to look, because we search for ourselves in the past. Our shape, our structures, our signatures. But what if they were nothing like us? No fire, no glass, no cities that touched the sky. Just minds, active, questioning, perhaps even communal, carried in forms we would call primitive, simply because they left no trace. Perhaps they never needed to mine. Perhaps they saw no need to cut down forests or carve mountains. Perhaps their intelligence led not to dominance, but to humility. And maybe that is why we haven't found them. Because we look for ruins, but they left none. Because we look for trash, but they had none. Because we look for metal, but they touched the earth lightly and moved on. And still, their absence feels strange. Like a page torn from a book we thought we understood. Because we assume civilization means impact. But what if it means awareness? The kind of awareness that asks not how much we can take, but how long we can remain. And what if they remained for a while? What if they flourished quietly, in tune with their changing world, until the climate shifted, or the forest fell, or the comet came? And when they were gone, there was nothing left but silence. No bones, no blades, no metal, just the shape of something that once was, now soft enough to vanish. And perhaps that is the great humility of deep time, to accept that we may not be the first, but only the first to shout across the ages, only the first to leave noise, and those who came before, if they came, whispered instead. So we strain to hear them, in rhythm, in myth, in the shape of tools that don't look like tools, in soil once tilled by hands that left no scars. We look, and sometimes we feel something, not proof, not data, but a presence, a trace of a trace, the quiet suggestion that civilization is not always forged in fire, but sometimes in silence. And silence has many forms. One of them is erosion, because long after civilizations fall, after the last voice, the last step, the last ember fades, what comes next is not fire or flood or even forgetting. What comes next is wind, rain, dust, time, the slow breath of earth unmaking what once stood proud. Erosion is patient. It doesn't rush. It doesn't shout. But it never stops. A hill worn down by centuries of rain. A cliff face collapsing grain by grain. A river pulling away the edges of memory, carrying them downstream to nowhere in particular. Even our strongest monuments, carved in marble, cast in steel, are only temporary visitors on a planet that prefers to start over. How long would it take for everything we've built to vanish? Not as a theory, as a reality. If humanity were to disappear tonight, all of us, all at once, what would remain? In 100 years, nature would begin to retake the cities. Roots cracking pavement, vines climbing steel, birds nesting in abandoned towers. In 1,000 years, roofs would collapse, glass would shatter, concrete would crumble. In 10,000, forests would swallow our monuments. Rust would devour our bridges. The desert would bury our solar panels. The ocean would reclaim our ports. And in 1,000,000 years, nothing, almost nothing, even our bones, those stubborn relics of biology, would be ground into sediment. Buildings turned to dust. Highways erased beneath jungle, ice, or floodplain. Our cities would become soft rises in the land, indistinct and unremarkable, just like the ones we've already walked over, just like the ones we never recognized. This is the power of erosion. Not destruction, but unmaking. It doesn't tear things down. It lets them fall slowly. And once fallen, it waits. The sun, the rain, the freeze, the thaw, lichen and moss and acid and time. And then, one day, the shape is gone. We tend to imagine the past in still frames, snapshots frozen and perfect, a ruin standing just as it fell, a fossil exactly where it landed. But the earth does not preserve in snapshots. Preserves in fragments if it preserves at all. And most often it doesn't. It wears down. It smooths over. It forgets. And the deeper we look into geologic time, the clearer that truth becomes. Where are the forests of the Devonian? Gone. Where are the mountains that rose in the early Proterozoic? Gone. Where are the cities, if there were any, from before the Cambrian? If they ever were, they too are gone. Because erosion eats everything. Not because it is cruel, but because that is its role. Even the continents are not spared. They are slowly ground down by weather and gravity, reduced grain by grain, washed into the sea. And in the sea, subduction waits, the slow conveyor belt of the planet, drawing crust back into the mantle, where nothing remains. And so we begin to understand that evidence is not the default. Absence is. We are not surprised when we find nothing. We are surprised when we find anything at all. And that changes the question. If the earth forgets everything, how do we remember? What kind of trace resists the wind? What kind of mark defies the rain? The answer is, not many. A few fossilized bones in the rarest of circumstances. A few stone tools if buried in the right kind of soil. A few isotopes, sealed in glacial ice or ancient rock. But mostly, nothing. Even history, recorded in books or servers or monuments, is fragile. A lost language, an erased archive, a cracked hard drive, and suddenly the story ends. Even memory, passed down through generations, thins and fades. Even myths erode. So we are left with questions. How much have we already lost? How many civilizations, experiments, or lifetimes have been erased not by war, but by weather? Not by collapse, but by time? If erosion is relentless, then so too must have been the forgetting. Not dramatic, but gentle. Not explosive, but constant. The rain does not rush. The wind does not judge. But they remember how to erase. And the earth, spinning slowly beneath all of this, allows it, because that is how new things begin. The rock breaks. The soil forms. The seed takes root. The old becomes the ground for the new. And if something once stood where we now stand, if someone once walked here, thought here, dreamed here, their presence may have become our foundation. Not remembered, but used, worn into sand, pressed into clay, carried in the rivers that now carve new valleys, feed new forests, support new thought. And so the earth forgets. And yet, in that forgetting there's a kind of mercy, a softness, because nothing lasts, and maybe nothing should. Maybe every age gets a season, a rise, a fall, a gentle erasure. Maybe every story ends not in fire, but in wind. And maybe the final act of any civilization is not its collapse, but its return, to the grain, to the dust, to the sea, to the wind, to the long patience of the earth, which always waits, and always begins again. Each time the earth resets, it writes a new page, a new layer, a new line in the long, stony language of geology. We call it stratigraphy, the study of layers, of sediment, of time laid down like quiet sentences. The ground beneath our feet isn't just soil. It's a story, a slow, layered memoir of everything that has happened. Floods, extinctions, blooms, droughts. Each layer tells us something. Thickness, grain, color, content. A volcanic ashfall preserved like punctuation. A fossilized fern pressed like a comma in limestone. A spike in iridium, the full stop of a mass extinction. Layer after layer. Each one a message. But only if we know how to read them. And that's the quiet, unsettling question. What if we've misread some of it? Or worse, what if we've missed entire chapters? The deeper we dig, the more cryptic the story becomes. The language of the planet is not always consistent, not always linear. Sometimes it skips, sometimes it stutters, and sometimes it seems to speak in code. Because not everything that changes a planet leaves obvious signs. We've learned to recognize certain signatures, impact events like the Chicxulub asteroid, large igneous provinces with their basalt flows and sulfur-rich layers, oxygenation events, glaciations, extinction pulses. But what if something else has written itself into the rock, using symbols we don't yet understand? What if an intelligent force once left its mark here, not in tools or temples, but in the chemistry of stone, a grammar too alien for our assumptions? Because we read the earth like it's written for us. But what if it isn't? What if the page was never meant for our eyes or our science or even our timeline? Geological layers don't preserve culture. They preserve change. They don't show what built the city, only what buried it. They don't reveal conversations, only composition. So if someone or something once altered the earth in a way we weren't expecting, would we even recognize it? A thin layer of fused glass. We assume impact, a spike in carbon. We assume volcanism, a magnetic reversal. We assume planetary rhythm. But what if one of these wasn't natural? What if one was deliberate? There is no chapter heading that says, "Here lived a civilization." No subtext that says, "This was made on purpose." We infer. We interpret. We overlay meaning onto rock. And sometimes the rock resists us. There are places in the geological record that don't add up. Time gaps, layers missing, strata that seem too sudden, too sharp, too selective. Fossils that vanish not gradually, but all at once, as if something swept them away mid-sentence. And when we see those gaps, we assume natural causes. But what if those missing lines were written in a different syntax? What if, somewhere in the Paleoproterozoic or the Silurian, something rose and changed the earth in ways we can't parse? Not because it wasn't preserved, but because it doesn't fit our vocabulary. We are used to metal. We are used to fire. We are used to tools that leave scars. But not all intelligence builds that way. Some intelligence might mold biology instead of stone. Leave its memory in altered DNA, in strange isotopic ratios, in the layout of an ancient biome that collapsed overnight. What if a genome is a monument? What if evolution was nudged? What if the Earth was terraformed not by us, not for us, but by something long gone? The idea is speculative, yes, but so is much of what deep time whispers. The rock record is not a clear narrative. It's fragmented, erased, scrambled by pressure and heat and age. We reconstruct the past from puzzles with most of the pieces missing. And in that silence, imagination becomes a kind of tool. Not for replacing evidence, but for asking different questions. Could this sharp boundary in the sediment be more than a natural threshold? Could this clay layer be more than ash? Could this missing time, this unconformity, be the fossil of an erased event? We think of civilization as structure. But maybe, in time, structure becomes indistinguishable from process. Maybe a civilization could be known by the way it alters the weather, the way it redistributes carbon, the way it organizes the biosphere. A layer of plastic is a technofossil. So is concrete. So is the absence of a species once common. So is a curve in the climate graph that shouldn't be there. And if we can leave such clues without trying, who's to say others couldn't? The stratigraphy of secrets may already hold them. We just haven't cracked the grammar. Because Earth's history is not written in our language. And if we only look for what we expect, we may never see what's actually there. The lines are waiting, the sentences already buried. And if we read them slowly enough, without rushing to name, to categorize, to dismiss, we may begin to feel a rhythm. Not our own, but familiar. The cadence of something that came before. Not an echo, but a presence, pressed into stone, quiet, patient, still unread, and perhaps never meant to be, because sometimes the earth forgets on purpose. Or maybe it simply can't hold memory the way we imagine it can. We speak of the earth as if it records everything, each fossil, each climate shift, each extinction, a memory pressed into stone. But memory, even in geology, is fragile, selective, incomplete, and the deeper we drift into the past, the more that memory fades. It's easy to forget that the planet has a mind of its own, not conscious but alive in its patterns, breathing through tectonics, pulsing through climate, evolving not only biologically but geologically. And in that movement, things are lost. The Earth is not an archive. It is a cycle, a living system constantly erasing and rebuilding itself. Plate drifts, a mountain rises, an ocean swells, then vanishes. Forests bloom and are buried. Time folds inward. The layers stack and then crack, twist, melt, and the memory slips. Does the earth remember? Or does it, too, forget? Each tectonic breath burying and erasing. Like sleep over a dream, we imagine memory as permanent. But the planet does not store it that way. The sleep is long, and deep, and full of amnesia. Whole continents have come and gone without leaving a single page behind. Ocean floors have opened, spread, and sunk over and over. Entire epochs have vanished into metamorphic rock. Heated, compressed, overwritten like a palimpsest too many times. And what do we do, then, with the possibility that something once lived, once flourished, but was folded into the crust and returned to magma? No bones, no echoes, not even a name, just heat, and the soft, drifting forgetfulness of stone. We build our understanding of the past on fragments, and those fragments are miracles. Fossils form only under rare conditions. Most life leaves no mark. Most stories are erased before they begin. So what of those that were never even etched? What of civilizations, if they existed, that never reached stone? Or reached it but were swallowed? It's not just the softness of their tools that would betray them. It's the Earth's own sleep. It's turning inward. Its layers, not just protective but recursive. Because while we look for clarity in the strata, the planet quietly rearranges them. It does not keep a perfect ledger. It is not a librarian. It is a dreamer, and its dreams drift. You can see it in the missing time, the unconformities, the breaks in the record, the layers that should be there but aren't. Whole chapters gone, erased by erosion or never written at all. And still we search for memory, in the folds of rock, in the chemistry of ice, in the sediment of lakes and the layering of caves. And sometimes the Earth answers. Sometimes we find a fossil that shouldn't exist, or a mineral in a place it doesn't belong. A spike in heat, a drop in oxygen, a whisper of catastrophe we never predicted. But other times there is only silence. And we wonder if we're asking the wrong question. Not what the Earth remembers, but how. Perhaps it doesn't remember in fossils. Perhaps it remembers in rhythms, in the recurrence of patterns, in the pulse of extinction and rebirth, in the subtle symmetry between now and 100 million years ago. Perhaps memory, for a planet, is not about preservation. It's about return, not holding on, but beginning again. And maybe that's why we can't find them, whoever they were, because their memory was not stored. It was lived, and when it ended, the planet exhaled and forgot, like waking from a dream with only the faintest feeling that something had happened. Something real, something meaningful, but the details are already gone. You reach for it, but there's nothing to hold, just the weight of something that was, and the quiet ache of not knowing. We tend to imagine the past as less advanced, less capable, less enlightened, as if wisdom only ever grows in one direction, as if intelligence must always mean progress, and progress must always mean noise. We picture our own technology as the pinnacle. Satellites, glowing screens, machines that hum and blink and spin. We expect that any civilization worthy of memory would leave monuments. Great towers, endless roads, metallic bones in the sand. Something big, something loud, something unmistakable. But what if wisdom isn't loud? What if the most advanced civilization to ever walk this earth was not the one that built the tallest, but the one that left the lightest touch? What if the future once came softly? We think of stone tools as primitive, not because they are useless, but because they are quiet. We think of woven fiber as fragile because it does not last. We think of natural materials as simple because they decay. But what if impermanence was not a flaw, but a choice? What if there was a kind of wisdom that saw what we have not, that to endure in harmony with a living planet, one must learn how to vanish without scars? Imagine a civilization not built on extraction, but on balance. Not on overcoming nature, but on integrating with it so completely that the line between creation and ecology disappeared. Houses grown like fruit, tools made of plant memory, energy drawn from the breath of the earth, from wind, from water, from temperature, from rhythm. Not wires but roots, not fire but fermentation, not noise but resonance. Would we even recognize it? Would we know how to see the traces of something so carefully made to blend in, so quietly shaped that even its tools turn back to soil within a season? Perhaps they built nothing permanent because they needed nothing permanent. Perhaps their technology was biodegradable thought, and their greatest machines lived, bloomed, and died, like any other organism. We would find no ruins, no trash heaps, no abandoned machinery, Only dust. Dust that once held meaning. Dust that once was structure. Dust that once was enough. And in our way of seeing, we'd miss it. We'd walk right past the place where they stood, mistaking it for wilderness, never knowing that beneath our feet, the land once thrummed with quiet intelligence. Because we're trained to find complexity in resistance, in hardness, in durability, in the refusal to change. But there is another kind of complexity, quieter kind, the kind that adapts, flexes, lets go, that knows how to become wind, how to become forest, how to become invisible, not because it failed, but because it succeeded. We often assume that the arc of intelligence leads to visibility, but maybe it leads to disappearance, to leave behind no monuments, no scars, no noise, only harmony, only dust. And what if that is wisdom, not the domination of the earth, but the integration into it? What if they were not erased? What if they simply ended, having done what they came to do, left not because of failure or collapse, but because their work was complete? They came, they learned, they lived, they listened, and when it was time, they let go. Could that be the true apex of civilization? Not to endure forever, but to vanish beautifully? To leave the world not worse, but better? To disappear not as victims of time, but as part of its design. We call that fantasy. We call it naive. But maybe that's because we've only known how to build loud, how to burn, how to stay. Maybe the greatest civilizations don't rise and fall. Maybe they bloom, and like flowers, they seed what's next, and drift quietly back into the soil. And maybe that's why we found nothing, because there was nothing meant to be found. Only a gentle shaping of the world, long since softened. Only wisdom in the dust. And yet, something in us still searches for more. Not just the memory, but the presence. Not just the whisper, but the echo, a shape in the dark, a pattern in the noise, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, we were not the first. Across centuries, humans have looked backward with wonder. Through myth, through ruins, through stone-carved symbols whose meanings have long unraveled. The idea of lost civilizations is not new. But what is new is the science finally catching up to the question. In 2018, two scientists, Gavin Schmidt, a climate scientist, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist, proposed a thought experiment now known as the Silurian hypothesis. Named, playfully, after a fictional intelligent reptilian species from science fiction, it asked, could an industrial civilization have existed on Earth millions of years before humans, and left no recognizable trace? It wasn't a declaration. It was an invitation to test our assumptions, to think bigger, to look for fingerprints not of structures, but of systems. Could such a civilization, if it had risen briefly, have left behind signs in the geological record? Carbon spikes, synthetic chemicals, disrupted ecosystems? And if so, would we even know how to see them? The answer they found was humbling. It would be very hard to know, because the Earth forgets, and erosion, as we've seen, eats intention. Even the signs we ourselves are currently leaving, plastics, soot, isotopes, may only last for a few million years at best. After that, it becomes noise, smudged ink in a book with missing pages. The Silurian hypothesis wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering how to wonder, and wondering carefully scientifically if we're truly alone in time. Because sometimes, questions lead us into places the data can't quite follow. But the questions still matter, because they help us look again. And in recent years, we've begun to look with new eyes. Across the globe, discoveries have stirred the imagination. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive megalithic structure buried for thousands of years, far older than expected, built before agriculture as we know it. It doesn't prove anything extraordinary, but it complicates the timeline, suggests that complexity came sooner than we thought. The Yonaguni Monument, off the coast of Japan, a series of massive underwater stone formations. Most scientists agree they're natural, but some details are hard to dismiss. Right angles, pillar shapes, features that suggest possible human shaping, in a place that may have been above sea level during the last ice age. There are ruins hidden in jungles, in deserts, under the ice. There are maps that seem to recall coastlines lost to sea rise. There are myths, thousands of them, that remember lands that sank, cities that fell, knowledge that vanished. None of these are proof, but they are patterns. Soft edges where science meets something older, something stranger, something not yet named. And that edge is worth walking. Because if we assume that all knowledge is already known, we close the door. But if we leave it open just a little, then new questions become possible. Could intelligence rise, fall, and rise again over spans so vast we mistake each rise as the first? Could civilizations have lived in the cradle of time, known the stars, known balance, known technologies unlike our own, and then gone so completely that only a tremble in the rock remains? Could the stories passed down by oral tradition, of floods, of golden ages, of sky people and lost lands, be fractured memories of real things, filtered through generations and metaphor? Science does not work by belief, but it moves forward through curiosity. And curiosity is alive in these questions, not as conspiracy, but as care, as willingness to say we don't know everything yet, because the earth is old, and its memory is older than we can grasp. And if we, today, were to vanish, how long would it take for our cities to disappear? Our books to dissolve? Our machines to fall silent? Would the species that came after us, 1,000,000 years from now, ever know we were here? Or would they walk across forgotten cities and call them hills? Would they scan the strata and call our technofossils anomalies? Would they hear myths we left behind and assume they were fiction? This happened before. We've found entire civilizations from our own history that we once believed were legend. Troy, Mohenjo-Daro, Nabta Playa, real places once doubted, now unearthed. Who's to say there aren't others? Deeper, older, hidden not by time alone, but by our own inability to see what doesn't fit. The Silurian hypothesis reminds us of something essential, that science doesn't always begin with answers. It begins with permission to ask. And in that space where imagination meets method, we might find something unexpected. Not Atlantis, not fantasy, but a deeper humility, a recognition that we may not be the first, and certainly won't be the last, and that somewhere beneath our feet, under stone, under sea, under stories, there may be the outline of something that once lived, once flourished, and was forgotten. Until now. But now is always fragile, because even stories, even entire worlds, can vanish in a breath. The Earth has known 5 great extinction events. 5 moments when life was not simply changed, but almost erased. Events so sweeping, so total, that they became punctuation marks in the history of existence. Sudden stops, abrupt silences, and perhaps not endings but resets. Each one cleared the canvas. Each one gave life another chance to begin, but on a different path. New forms, new rhythms, new mistakes. But what did those events take with them? What did they sweep away so completely that even memory itself could not hold on? We think of extinction as loss of species, the ammonites, the trilobites, the towering dragonflies and lumbering mammals. But what if extinction took more than bones? What if it took stories, too? What if it took knowledge? And what if, buried in the fossil record, beneath those sudden voids, those strange disappearances, there once lived something we can no longer see? 5 times, Earth has collapsed into quiet, each time for a different reason. The Ordovician, sudden glaciation, sea levels falling, entire marine ecosystems gone. The late Devonian, a drawn-out decline, a mystery still not fully understood. The Permian Triassic, the worst of them all. Over 90 of species wiped out. A world suffocating under heat and acid and ash. The Triassic-Jurassic, another pulse, another reshaping. And the most recent, the Cretaceous-Paleogene event. The end of the dinosaurs. The beginning of something new. We name them clinically, but what they truly were endings, and possibly erasures. Because if intelligence ever bloomed before, if a civilization once rose quietly and briefly before we learned to count such things, then what better way to hide it than beneath a mass extinction? Not as cause, but as casualty. If something intelligent walked the Earth before the Permian Triassic extinction, would we know? Would we see their ruins? Or would all signs have been crushed by the flood basalt, the runaway greenhouse gases, the collapse of ecosystems that followed? Would they have cried out? Would they have tried to leave a mark? Or did they fall into silence before the rock could remember? Extinctions don't just end life. They unmake context. They confuse the record, bury the trail, disrupt the continuity we depend on to understand the past. They redraw the map with no memory of what came before. And so we stare at the gaps, the voids in the fossil timeline, the strange, sharp cliffs of sudden absence. And we wonder, what fell before the fall? We assume extinction means weakness, failure. But what if something strong, something intelligent, something capable of story, was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Would we know? Or would we walk across the ashes, never realizing what had once burned there? We see extinction as natural, as necessary, the price of evolution. But what if it's also a curtain? What if it hides not just the dead, but the dreamers? There is a silence beneath the Permian rock that feels deeper than others. There is an emptiness in the late Devonian that resists full explanation. There are patterns in the data that we squint at and still don't fully understand. Perhaps it's only nature. Perhaps it's only the planet reshaping itself as it always does. But perhaps one of those extinctions didn't just remove species. Perhaps it removed a story, one we were never meant to read, or one we were never ready for. We search for signs of climate change, of impact, of flood and fire. But what if the sign is what's missing? A layer erased too cleanly, a fossil record too thin, a change too sharp to be slow. Could intelligence vanish that way? Could thought itself be reset? We know it almost happened to us. Just 70,000 years ago, a supervolcanic eruption may have brought humanity close to collapse. A bottleneck, a breath away from silence. It doesn't take much. The earth is powerful, and memory here is always conditional. So we look at extinction not just as an end, but as a veil, a boundary we may never cross. Because if something lived before the last silence, it may never speak again. Not in fossils, not in myths, not in science, just in the quiet possibility that something once was, and is no longer, and will never be again. But somehow, we still remember. Even when there is nothing left to hold, we carry something. Not in data, not in stone, but in story. Because there's a strange thing we've learned to notice. The same story told in many places, in many voices, across oceans, across time. A story of a golden age. A fall. A flood. A fire. It appears in different clothing, different names. But its shape is familiar. Repeating. Echoed like a rhythm across cultures that never met. The Sumerians told of kings who ruled before the flood, their reigns lasting thousands of years. The Greeks wrote of a time when mortals lived among gods, when the world was kinder, simpler, until something changed. The Hopi spoke of previous worlds, each destroyed when people lost their way. In Hindu tradition, the cycles of yugas flow from light into darkness, each age a little more shadowed than the one before. The Maya remembered a world remade. The Norse had Ragnarok. The Egyptians, a hidden kingdom beneath the sands. Over and over again, we hear it. The first light, the fall, the forgetting, a spark, and then the silence. What are these stories? Fables? Dreams? Cautionary tales repeated by firesides and temple walls? Or are they something older? Could these be the fossilized memories of a world long gone? If we accept that geological memory fades, that erosion, fire, subduction erase what was, then what survives? Not the structures, but the myths. If a civilization once rose, then fell long before our calendars, long before our counting. Perhaps the only pieces that survived were the ones that could be told. Not explained, but felt. Not facts, but metaphors. Memories, broken by time, passed like stones from hand to hand. There is something universal about the myth of the first flame, the idea that we were once closer to something greater, that we lost it, that we are trying to find our way back. Is it nostalgia for a simpler time? Or is it something deeper, a hint of memory stored not in rock, but in the recesses of human thought, genetic, emotional, poetic. Carl Jung spoke of archetypes, deep patterns in the human mind that appear again and again. But what if these patterns are not only psychological? What if some of them are historical? Not in the way a textbook remembers, but in the way a dream does, because dreams too fossilize. They hold shapes even when the context dissolves. So many of our ancient stories speak of knowledge lost, of fire stolen from the gods, of languages scattered, of towers reaching too high, of secrets buried under waves or sealed inside mountains. Perhaps these stories are symbolic, but perhaps symbols are all we have left. What would you remember if everything else was gone? What kind of truth can survive collapse? Maybe only this, that something once was, that it was bright, that it broke, that we were left with silence. And maybe that's what the first flame really is. Not the first use of fire, but the first knowing. The first time a species looked outward and inward and saw something more than survival. The first time it wondered about its place. The first time it reached for meaning. And the first time it lost it. A golden age not of technology but of understanding. And the fall, not from paradise but from balance. So the stories came, as warnings, as riddles, as promises wrapped in myth. They told us to be careful, to remember, to build better next time, to respect the silence. But we forgot what they were for. We built again. And in doing so, we told new stories, new myths of light and fall, of fire and flood. Maybe not because they were fantasies, but because they were echoes, faint memories of something true, not provable, but real. And so we stand here now in our own firelit age, wondering if the first flame was ever truly first, or if it was simply the first we can still feel. There may have been others, long extinguished, still glowing, in myth, but myth alone is not enough. So we turn to the rocks, because even if memory fades, even if stories twist and scatter, the earth still holds something deeper, a record not of thought, but of consequence, the quiet trace of action, of change, of impact. And this is where science now listens, not for monuments, but for technosignatures. These are not fossils, not tools or walls or bones, but patterns in chemistry, in layers, in atmosphere, changes that hint at industry, at intelligence. Proof not of life, but of doing. We already know what we're leaving behind. Plastics pressed into the sediment. Concrete and aluminum in vast, unnatural quantities. Nitrogen and phosphorus spread across soil at planetary scale. Carbon isotopes tilted by fossil fuel combustion. Synthetic compounds never before seen in nature, and now part of it. We are writing ourselves into the earth. And if we can see our own signature, we have to ask, would we recognize someone else's? Could we tell if a civilization had come before, not one like ours, but one that reached a similar inflection point, altering its world in ways only chemistry can recall? It's a strange kind of archaeology. There are no ruins to visit, no artifacts to touch, only rocks, core samples drawn from the ocean floor, layers of shale, bands of clay. We study the ratios of carbon-12 to carbon-13. We analyze noble gases, trace metals, magnetism. We look for spikes that don't match volcanism, don't follow expected biological rhythms, don't fit into what Earth should be saying. We look for the unnatural within the natural, and sometimes we find it. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a sharp spike in global temperatures 56 million years ago. Ocean acidification, widespread species turnover, a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere. Fast, violent, and still unexplained. Was it methane from the seafloor? Volcanic activity? A massive peat fire? Or something else? Something intentional? We don't know. But the shape of the change feels familiar. Too familiar. Like the curve of our own doing. Other layers tell other strange stories. The great oxygenation event, life altering the atmosphere in a way never before seen. Anomalous metal concentrations in ancient sediments. Rare isotope distributions that hint at processes not fully understood. Some of it is natural. But natural is not always easy to define. And when nature behaves in unexpected ways, we begin to wonder, are we alone in time? Or are we just the first to leave behind something we can still measure? The term technosignature was first used to imagine how we might detect extraterrestrial life through radio waves, satellites, Dyson spheres. But now, scientists are using it here at home to ask, could we find evidence of technology without the technology itself? Could we see the shadow of industry, a byproduct, a disruption, a mark not of presence, but of pressure? If a civilization once mined the earth, refined metals, burned fuels, cultivated vast ecosystems, altered the weather, would the rocks remember? Would the biosphere adapt? Would the signal fade or linger? Even now, we look at the Anthropocene, this proposed new geological epoch, as the start of a signature, the beginning of a chapter where one species reshapes the whole. And if we can see our own technosignature forming, could we detect another? It may not look the same. Maybe they never used plastic. Maybe their chemistry ran on elements we don't yet understand. Maybe their structures were organic, their energy drawn from systems that left fewer marks. But some residue always remains. No action is truly neutral. No civilization, no matter how gentle, is invisible to the earth it inhabits. So we scan the strata. We scan for secrets. We scan for signals buried in silence. Not because we're chasing fantasy, but because we're testing our humility. Because if the rocks can speak of us, then maybe they already speak of someone else. We just haven't learned how to listen. Not yet. But maybe soon. But perhaps the silence we're listening to isn't silence at all. Perhaps it's breath. Because while we measure time in minutes, in years, in generations, the earth does not. The earth breathes in slow, unhurried rhythms. Tides that rise not by the hour, but by the epoch. Seasons that stretch for millennia. Winters that last 100,000 years. Summers that span a continent. Its inhale is an ice age. Its exhale a flood of green, and everything in between, the slow drift of continents, the hum of evolving species, the reshaping of coastlines, is part of that long, ancient rhythm. Deep time, a scale so vast we can't hold it in the mind all at once. Not because it's too complex, but because it's too still. It asks us to slow down, to wait, to feel the pulse of something that doesn't move fast enough to be seen, but never truly stops. We tend to rush through history, flipping through chapters, chasing the next milestone. But the earth isn't in a hurry. It never has been. When mountains rise, they rise so slowly it looks like nothing is happening at all. When oceans spread, they do so quietly, like breath filling a chest too large to see. When the atmosphere changes, it hums across millions of years, not minutes. And we, temporary, flickering, fast, barely notice. But deep time notices us. It watches. It absorbs. It records in its own way. Not with memory, but with balance. Not with accuracy, but with rhythm. What we call climate change, Earth sees as a stutter in its breath. What we call extinction, it sees as an exhale, painful, yes, but familiar. This doesn't mean Earth is indifferent. It simply means it plays a longer game. And if something once lived here before us, intelligent, organized, capable of change, it too would have been caught in that breath. It would have risen during an inhale, collapsed with an exhale. It would have seemed vast in its own time, and small in the rhythm of Earth. Because deep time doesn't remember names. It remembers movement. It doesn't remember buildings. It remembers weight. Not the weight of stone, but of consequence. Of what was changed, what was shifted, what was burned. It remembers carbon. It remembers oxygen. It remembers imbalance and recovery. And through it all, it breathes. Geologists read this breath in rock layers, in sediment, in isotope curves, in the patterns left behind by ice sheets and sea levels, by fossils and radiometric decay. Each inhale marked by calm, each exhale by upheaval. Planet not in crisis, but in cycle. And if we stretch our perception, soften our pace, we can almost feel it, almost align ourselves to it. Imagine thinking in tens of millions of years. Imagine patience so complete you could wait out a mountain range. Imagine seeing your own civilization not as a peak, but as a pulse, a brief acceleration in the deep breath of Earth. It's humbling, but also freeing, because in this rhythm no story is final. No collapse is total. No silence lasts forever. The breath continues, and each time something ends, something else is invited to begin. So what does that make us? A spark? A signal? A pause? And what of those who came before, if they came? Were they too caught in the breath? Lifted in a warm cycle, and dropped again in a cold one? Is that why we can't find them? Because the earth exhaled and they were gone. Not by fire, not by war, but by rhythm. A civilization erased by the same breath that once allowed it to bloom. And maybe if we learn to slow down, to feel that rhythm, we won't need to find their ruins. We'll sense their echo, folded into the inhale, stilled in the exhale, resting in the long, quiet breath of deep time. But perhaps, in that stillness, something else lingers. Not thought, not voice, but memory. Not ours, not biological, but planetary. We tend to believe that memory belongs to us, to neurons, to brains, to language. That remembering is a human act, maybe an animal one at most. But what if memory doesn't need a nervous system? What if it can be carried not in thought, but in pattern? What if the earth itself remembers? Not in words, not in images, but in rhythm, in reaction, in echo. Magnetic fields, shifting every few 100,000 years, like a heartbeat too slow to hear. Chemical cycles repeating across epochs, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, always adjusting, responding, returning. Crystal lattices in minerals, holding atomic alignments shaped by ancient pressures. Tree rings, ice cores, sediment bands, each a line in a language we've only begun to read. Memory without intention, memory without mind, but memory still. Even rock remembers stress, even water remembers shape, even air remembers what it carried. Could the earth itself be recording the past in ways we haven't yet learned to recognize? When we look at fossils, we see biological memory preserved, life caught in the moment of its ending. But there are other fossils too, less obvious. Fossils of climate, of chemistry, of geomagnetic shift. These are not fossils of form, but of state. A frozen ocean current, preserved in salt. A mountain folded by collisions from half a world away. A glacial erratic, a boulder that remembers where the ice once came from and how far it carried the past. Perhaps memory doesn't need to know in order to hold. Perhaps the planet is full of storage, silent and strange, encoded not in DNA, but in pattern, in symmetry, in recurrence. Even symmetry, the quiet tendency of things to organize, to mirror, to reflect, might be a kind of memory, a way the universe keeps track of itself. Repeating forms in nature, in snowflakes, in shells, in galaxies. Maybe these aren't just accidents, but echoes. Could a pattern, once set in motion, ripple forever? Could a cycle, set by ancient hands or older forces, continue long after its origin has been forgotten? Could the spin of electrons, the paths of minerals, the shape of winds, all be echoes of a time before language? And if so, what does that make us? Are we remembering something when we build in circles, when we repeat rituals, when we return again and again to the same myths? Or are we simply falling into the deeper rhythm of a memory we don't realize we're part of? We assume memory is linear, but the earth doesn't move in straight lines. It turns. It circles. It returns. Maybe memory is not a file. Maybe it's a field, a magnetic hum, a chemical bias, a shape that wants to be remembered. And if the earth holds memory like this, softly, structurally, then it may remember things no story ever told, things no human ever saw. It may remember a presence, a shaping, a touch that once changed the temperature of oceans, the makeup of clouds, the composition of stone. Not a memory of facts, but of forces. Not names, but impacts. Not language, but weight. And perhaps that's what we're listening for. Not proof, but recognition. the soft impression of something once imprinted, still held. Not in biology, but in the earth itself. Still held, but held so gently that we may never feel it. Because not all signals are meant for us, and not all signals are understood. If a non-human intelligence once rose on this planet, if it climbed quietly toward thought, toward culture, toward shaping its world, how would we know? Would we see the signal clearly? Or would we dismiss it as anomaly? Every day, scientists encounter things they cannot explain. Spikes in data, unexpected formations, outlier chemical traces, ruins that seem too aligned, stones that seem too shaped. Sometimes nature surprises us. And sometimes we walk away thinking we've seen everything because we've named what we found. But naming isn't knowing. And anomaly is often just another word for we don't understand yet. If a forgotten species once spoke, not with language but with the earth itself, would we hear them? If they carved nothing, built nothing tall, left no metal or plastic, would their voice be too soft for us to hear? We imagine intelligence in our own image, structured, technological, tool-bound, self-preserving. But what if their intelligence was fluid, cooperative, spread across a forest canopy or a coral reef, never centralized but still aware? What if their signals were not machines, but migrations, not cities, but synchronies, not digital code, but frequencies pulsing from skin, from shell, from soil? We might never notice, or worse, we might notice and ignore, because the signal doesn't look like a message, because it doesn't come on a channel we're tuned to receive. There are radio pulses from deep space that repeat just enough to be suspicious, but not enough to be certain. There are patterns in the fossil record, strange bursts of change, sudden silences, that don't line up neatly with the known. There are geological scars that speak of pressure without violence, change without cause. Could these be the remnants of something not natural but not human? Could they be the blurred residue of a presence that didn't want to dominate, only to exist? We often forget. Intelligence doesn't require ambition. It doesn't always climb. It doesn't always expand. It doesn't always seek to leave a mark. Some intelligence may simply want to witness, to understand, to belong, and when the time came, to end, gracefully, without ruin, without legacy, only a signal left behind, faint, embedded in the pattern of things. A change in how light reflects from a mineral surface. A shift in the way certain elements bond in a once-living shell. A resonance in the Earth's crust that doesn't quite match its expected frequency. Not loud, not impossible, just not explained. And so we file it away. Anomalous, unlikely, dismissed. But what if those are the signs? What if intelligence leaves not a trail, but a question? A subtle adjustment in the balance of things. A signal we keep finding but never recognize. Or worse, one we recognize, but misinterpret. Like archaeologists of the far future finding one of our satellites, mistaking it for a meteorite. Like ants walking across a book, unaware of the meaning pressed into the pages beneath them. Could we be the ants? Could we be standing in the ruins of a forgotten species and not even know? Could their signal be all around us, not calling out, but resting, not reaching up, but settling in? There are ancient structures on this planet, natural as far as we can tell, that are more precise than we'd expect. There are growth patterns in fungi and coral that resemble neural networks. There are migratory instincts in birds, in fish, in butterflies that suggest a kind of memory we don't yet understand. Could these be echoes? Not of machines, not of speech, but of intelligence lived differently? What if the signal is not a sound, but a shape? Not a voice, but a balance? What if we are surrounded by the traces of thought? Thought that came before us, thought that was never ours, and all we can say is, something strange happened here, we don't know why. And so we shrug. We move on. Because it's easier to forget a question than to live inside it. But maybe the next time we find something that doesn't belong, a chemical layer with no clear origin, a fossilized structure that seems too regular, a change in the Earth's rhythm that arrives too suddenly. Maybe then we pause, and we listen, not for answers, but for presence, for the possibility that we are not the first to wonder, to shape, to disappear, and that what remains isn't a warning, or a monument, but a signal, still humming beneath our feet. And if we lean in close enough, if we let the stillness wrap around us, let the centuries soften our pace, we might realize the rocks are speaking. They always have been. But we, in our hunger for answers, have only been listening for the loudest stories. The shouts of volcanoes, the crush of tectonic plates, the sharp signatures of impact craters and mass extinctions. The noise. We've learned to hear catastrophe. But what if the earth speaks in quieter tongues? What if geology is a language of ghosts, not the kind that haunt halls, but the kind that linger in pattern, in pressure, in the slow folding of time? What if, pressed into the layers of stone, there are echoes not of storms, but of thought? It's easy to forget that rock is not static. It moves, it bends, it changes. Every fault line, every mineral vein, every sedimentary band is a line in a sentence billions of years long. The cliffs and canyons are not just landscape. They are literature, and we are only beginning to learn how to read. We decipher extinction in dark clay, climate in layers of pollen and ash, migration in isotopes, starbursts in iridium. But perhaps the subtler messages are the ones we miss. Not because they are hidden, but because they are unfamiliar. Could consciousness, non-human, ancient, untranslatable, leave an impression not in artifacts, but in arrangement? Could thought ripple outward into form, into symmetry, into sequences of matter that appear natural, but carry intention? Could an idea shape a mountain? Could a memory bend a river? We wouldn't know how to see it. Not yet. We're trained to spot the physical tools, structures, bones. But if something once lived here that did not build as we do, that did not record as we do, that did not even think as we do, then what it left behind might not look like a ruin. It might look like geology. There are patterns in rock that baffle us. Strange geometries in crystalline structures. Perfect spheres embedded in ancient stone. Repeating sequences in fossil-free layers. Lines that stretch for miles, too straight to be accident, too natural to be confirmed. We often explain them away. Erosion, coincidence, time and pressure. And often, that's true. But even coincidence has a rhythm. Even erosion can be directed. And if we read the rocks not just as record but as response to life, to change, to presence, then perhaps we begin to see more than process. We begin to see traces of minds that didn't leave monuments, of lives that didn't leave bones, of civilizations that knew how to shape the world softly. What if we're standing in the ruins already? What if the land itself is a monument? Not a carving, but a conversation between life and stone, between thought and gravity, between what was and what wanted to remain. Geologists often speak of formational environments, the specific settings in which certain rocks, minerals, and structures emerge. But what if some environments were formed by something else? Not heat, not pressure, but purpose? What if someone once used geology as a language? What if they learned how to speak with the earth, not by force but by harmony? To align the crystal, to tilt the fault, to seed the sediment, to leave a message that wouldn't look like a message at all, until the right eyes finally opened. It would be the perfect hiding place, not beneath the earth, but as the earth, a whisper in granite, a rhythm in limestone, a pulse in the layering of an ancient cliff. We might walk past it every day, call it beautiful, call it mysterious, call it natural, and never think, this was meant. But deep down, some part of us might feel it, a strange stillness, a resonance, the way a particular shape settles into the mind and stays there, even when we don't understand why. We are drawn to some places more than others. We call them sacred. We say they have energy. We build our temples and cities near them, not always knowing why. Maybe they're just beautiful, or maybe they remember. Maybe the land holds stories we were meant to find again, not with our instruments, but with our intuition, not with data, but with listening. And as we listen, geology becomes something more than record. It becomes relic. It becomes ghost, not haunting us, but waiting, not screaming from the cliffs, but humming through them. And maybe that's what we felt all along. Not absence, but presence, pressed into the walls of canyons, folded into the roots of mountains, drifting through the sediment of rivers that have changed their names 100 times over. Maybe the earth is not just our home. Maybe it is also a library, a quiet, patient, ancient keeper of things we've never truly understood. And every time we split a rock, every time we unearth a fossil, every time we dig into a cliffside and feel that breath of cool air rising from a place untouched for millions of years, maybe we're opening a page and reading the language of ghosts. We begin to feel something deeper, a rhythm, a return, a shape repeating itself through layers too vast for memory. Because what if civilization doesn't rise once and last forever? What if it pulses? What if intelligence isn't a straight line from simplicity to complexity, but a breath? Inhale, awakening. Exhale, forgetting. And in between, the long sleep. It's comforting to think of ourselves as the first to build, to reach, to wonder. But the earth may be older than even that idea. And perhaps so is intelligence. What if this planet has dreamed before? What if, in some ancient age, another mind stirred, not human, not even familiar, but curious, capable, connected, and brief? What if that story ended, not in flame, not in ruin, but in rest? The kind of rest that comes after a long journey. The kind of sleep that settles into deep time, not to vanish, but to wait. Because time to the earth is not linear. It loops. It breathes. It turns back on itself, soft as a tide. Species rise, evolve, vanish. Forests bloom and are buried. Seas appear, vanish, appear again. And maybe civilization is no different. Maybe what we call progress is just a part of the cycle. A bright moment between long silences. A flare of consciousness. Then rest. Not collapse. Not failure. Just release. And in the quiet that follows, the planet breathes again. Heals. Forgets. Until the next spark. The next try. The next breath. There is a theory in cosmology known as eternal recurrence. The idea that time might repeat itself endlessly across vast cycles of the universe. That everything we do may have already happened. And may happen again. But perhaps that's not just a cosmic idea. Perhaps it's a planetary one. What if intelligence is not rare, but cyclical? What if Earth is not a cradle once, but many times, a stage on which awareness rises, plays, rests, and begins again? We wouldn't know. Not easily. Not with tools that only see the surface. Because after each breath, the world softens its edges, covers the traces. It sings its forests back over the ruins. It raises new mountains from old ones, presses memory into silence. And so the past becomes unreadable, not because it was never written, but because the page was turned too many times. Still, the idea lingers, that we are not the first, not the only, not the beginning, that others may have come before us, not greater, not lesser, only earlier, and laid the seeds of thought into soil we now stand on unaware. Maybe they rose with the glaciers, or when the seas were warm and high. Maybe they saw a different sky. Maybe they burned too bright, or faded too softly. And maybe they, too, asked what came before them. Maybe this question, are we alone in time, is part of the cycle. Maybe it returns every time the spark returns. Maybe the asking is the sign of awakening, and the silence that follows, the sign of sleep. What would it mean to know this? That civilization is not a singular arc, but a rhythm? It might humble us, but it might also comfort us. Because if this is a cycle, then collapse is not the end. It's the pause. It's the breath. And breath means life. It means return. It means that even after the stillest night, something may stir again. Not us. Not necessarily. But something. A new spark. A new rhythm. A new song. And maybe, just maybe, that song will remember ours. Not in language. Not in ruins. But in feeling. in instinct, in the quiet urge to wonder, and reach, and begin again. Because the long sleep is not forgetting. It is rest. And Earth has always dreamed between awakenings. But what happens when the dream ends? Not pauses, not resets, but ends. It's a question we rarely ask, not because we fear the answer, but because we don't know how to hear it. Are we just another pulse in the long breath of time? Or are we the last one? Will our cities fade into the same silence that swallowed the ones before? Will our roads, our satellites, our networks dissolve beneath rising forests and shifting stone? Or will something different happen this time? Is this not just another cycle, but a conclusion? In every extinction before us, the planet recovered. Slowly, patiently, the forests returned. The oceans rebalanced. The atmosphere adjusted its rhythm. But now, the question isn't just about collapse. It's about capacity. What if we've pushed beyond the edge of return? What if the rhythm we thought eternal is fragile? What if the pulse can stop? Because this time it is not a volcano, not an asteroid, not a glacial shift or a slow-burning sun. This time it is us. We are both the builders and the disruptors. We are the ones who shaped the Anthropocene, and the ones who feel it trembling beneath our feet. The climate remembers our breath. The oceans hold our heat. The land wears the weight of our extraction. And we begin to wonder, softly, quietly, late at night, are we writing the last chapter? Or are we only forgetting, again, how many chapters came before? Maybe this is how it always feels, just before the pause. Maybe every civilization believes it is the last. Maybe that belief is part of the turning, the slowing, the hush before the long sleep. Or maybe this time really is different. Maybe the Earth cannot hold another memory. Not in its atmosphere, not in its soil, not in its bones. Maybe this is the end of not just a story, but the story. And if that's true, what do we do with it? How do we live, knowing we may be the last verse in a fading planetary song? Some would say, hurry, build louder, burn brighter, make a mark deep enough to never be erased. But perhaps there is another way. Perhaps we can choose to end not in fire, but in grace. To slow ourselves, to soften, to become part of the rhythm again, rather than its disruption. To be the breath, not the break. If we are the last spark, then let us glow gently. Let us warm, not burn. Let us leave behind not ruins, but resonance. Because even a final verse can carry beauty. Even the last light of a star still reaches across space long after the star itself has gone. Maybe we don't need to be remembered in stone. Maybe it is enough to be remembered in pattern, in balance restored, in silence honored, in the long curve of recovery that follows us. Maybe memory does not always need a name. Maybe it only needs care. Maybe the final act of a civilization is not to endure, but to allow the earth to breathe again, to return the story to the soil, to say we were here, we learned, we listened, and now we rest. But maybe, just maybe, this is not the end. Maybe the breath is still turning. Maybe the cycle continues. Maybe another spark waits far beyond us, quiet now, seated in dust, watching stars we will never see. And maybe they, too, will ask, were we the first? Or just the next? Do the rocks still whisper of us? Maybe they will find our signal. Not in plastic, not in fire, but in the pause we finally allowed. The silence we left behind. The space in which something new might begin. But before that beginning, we arrive here. At the edge. The place where land meets sea, where data meets doubt, where science meets silence. The shoreline of the forgotten. We've traveled through layers of stone and memory, of time and unknowing. We've held the shape of ancient questions in our hands, turned them over in the light, felt their weight. Not as burden, but as invitation. And now we reach the place where even the questions begin to fade. Not because they're answered, but because some things cannot be answered. Not cleanly, not yet. The earth does not explain itself. It offers traces, clues, patterns, pauses, but not conclusions. And so we walk the shoreline, that soft boundary between knowing and not, where every tide uncovers something and carries something else away. Here, myths become geology. Geology becomes metaphor, and metaphor becomes the only language left that feels true. Did something live here before the stories we tell? Did it think or build or leave behind a signal? Did it burn? Did it bloom? Did it end? We don't know. And maybe we're not meant to. Maybe the purpose of these questions isn't to solve anything, but to slow us down, to soften the way we see, to widen the space between certainty and silence. Because the shoreline doesn't divide, connects. It's where memory becomes mist, where reason reaches as far as it can, and wonder takes the next step. So many cultures speak of the sea as sacred, not because of what it holds, but because of what it hides. Not because it is knowable, but because it reminds us how much we'll never know. And maybe that's where truth lives. Not in proof, but in presence. Not in answers, but in attention. We've asked, could Earth have been inhabited before the dinosaurs? But beneath that question is a deeper one. Not what was here, but what could have been, and beneath that, what else are we not seeing? We leave this shoreline with no firm ground beneath us. Only sand, only tide, only stories. But that's how all stories end, not with closure, but with echo. Not with final words, but with a question left behind. And the question is still breathing, still walking, still waiting to be heard again by someone new on some other shoreline in some other time. Maybe ours, maybe not, in some other time, on some other shoreline. But even now, even here, the stones still whisper. You don't need language to feel it. You only need stillness. The surface of a cliff warmed by sun. The bones of a mountain cracked and folded. A single rock weathered smooth by rivers that are no longer there. They don't shout. They don't demand. They only speak when we choose to slow down long enough to listen. And what they say is not story exactly. It's rhythm. It's memory without names. It's presence without explanation. Even in silence, the stones speak. Of pressure. Of motion. Of heat that once boiled from the earth's core and changed everything it touched. Of forests that rose and fell, crumbled into peat, hardened into coal. Of oceans that expanded, filled with life, then retreated into dust. Of winds that sculpted the land like breath shaping a flame. They whisper of life that was never fossilized, and of fossils we have not yet found. Of things that came and went not because they failed but because that's what time does. Passes. And in that passing it transforms. What we call stone was once something else. Shell. Sand. Coral. Sometimes even cities. Sometimes even the living. That is the quiet miracle of geology, that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form, and that means the stones hold more than just matter. They hold traces of meaning, unspoken, unwritten, but real. And so we wonder, did something walk this earth before us? Did it know? Did it change the world or simply exist within it? Did it leave behind not monuments but shifts, subtle adjustments in temperature, in chemistry, in magnetic flow? Would we recognize such traces? Or would we look right through them, calling them natural because we don't yet have the language to say they're not? Sometimes we think of knowledge as something stored in books, in files, in servers. But the earth stores differently. It holds what happened, not always why, keeps the pattern, not the plan. It preserves not the voice, but the weight of what was said. And so the stones still whisper, not to tell us everything, but to remind us that not everything is lost. They whisper of eras that left no survivors, of pulses that came before our own, of intelligence that may have looked nothing like us, but left a signal anyway. A signal we haven't heard yet, a signal we might never recognize, but one that's still here, waiting, not loudly, not in desperation, just in place, just in rhythm. Sometimes we see the whisper in symmetry, a repeated curve in a fossilized reef, a perfect spiral in ancient shells. Sometimes we feel it in absence, the sudden vanishing of species, the missing strata, the gaps where something should be. and isn't. And sometimes we simply stand in a canyon or by a cliff or at the base of a hill older than memory. And we feel that something was here. We don't know what. We don't know when. But the land feels shaped, held, lived in, stilled, like a room just recently left. This is not science, exactly. And it's not mythology. It's something in between, where curiosity meets intuition, where wonder becomes a method, and where listening becomes the only tool that matters. Because even now, the earth is still speaking. The strata still shift. The layers still rise. We are walking across pages still being written. And we are adding our own. With every footprint, every fire, every tower, every emission, every thought. We are not just readers of the earth's memory. We are part of it. And one day, long after we're gone, someone or something may lean down, touch the stone, and ask the same question we've been asking all along. Was someone here before me? And maybe the stone will answer. Maybe not with words, but with warmth, with rhythm, with the subtle pattern of what remains. And the answer will be yes, because we were, because others may have been, because the earth remembers in silence. And the stones even now are still whispering. But maybe they are not whispering to us alone. Maybe we are simply the latest ones to lean close, to listen, to wonder, to imagine. And as we listen, we begin to feel something shift. Not in the earth, but in us. A soft unraveling of certainty. A gentle loosening of the story we thought we knew, that we are the peak, the first, the only. Because something deeper is stirring beneath that idea. Something older. Something quieter. We are not the beginning. Not of life. Not of mind. Not of memory. We are a moment. A flicker in the long night of the planet. A candle held up in the dark. Not to conquer it, but to join the others that may have burned before. And as our light dances, we start to see the faintest reflections around us. Echoes. Not loud. Not clear. But present. A strange isotope here. A fossil-free layer there. A rhythm in the rocks that doesn't match the beat of biology. Not evidence, but invitation. To widen our lens. To soften our definitions. To entertain the possibility that intelligence is not rare, just hidden. Not singular, but cyclical. We end where we began. In wonder, because that's where all true understanding starts. Not in answers, but in questions that linger, refusing to settle, refusing to close. What if we are not the first? What if this planet has dreamed before? What if we are not a miracle, but a rhythm? A natural consequence of a world that, given enough time, will always try again. Always rise, always reach, not always in the same form, not always in the same light, but always. And maybe that is the true legacy of life on Earth. Not the structures it leaves behind, but the questions it passes forward. Each species, each spark, asking, who came before me? Will someone come after? What will they find? And will they understand? We may never know who built the first fire. We may never know if another fire was lit long before that one. We may never know if the myths we tell are dreams or memories. But we know this, the earth keeps turning. The deep time breathes. And somewhere in the stone, in the oceans, in the echoes of forgotten forests and the shadows of vanished reefs, there are patterns we haven't read yet. Stories not lost, just quiet. And in our own age, with our cities, our satellites, our brief century of speed, we are writing a new chapter in that deeper book. We are not just observers. We are the signal now. What will we leave behind? What shape will our breath take when it settles into stone? Will we be another pulse? Or the last one? We cannot know. But we can choose how we move through this moment. With curiosity, with reverence, with the humility to understand that we are not the beginning and never were. We are an echo. We are a thread in a larger weave, one we cannot see from here, but one we can feel. In every fossilized ripple, in every silent canyon, in every myth that refuses to die. This world has held many stories. Ours is only one. And yet, it matters. Not because it is final, but because it is part of the rhythm. Part of the remembering, part of the long, slow, gentle turning of something we may never fully understand. And so we close this journey as we opened it, not with certainty, but with awe, not with the noise of answers, but with the quiet, enduring hum of the planet's memory, still speaking, still holding, still dreaming, perhaps of what came before us, perhaps of what may come again.